On November 6, 1994, Jan Balmain stands on the platform of Newcastle railway station, Australia. She cranes her neck, trying to catch sight of the approaching train. Jan eagerly awaits the arrival of her 22-year-old daughter, Revelle, who boarded the train to Sydney. The journey takes just 2 hours. A mother waits, anticipating her daughter, an extraordinarily beautiful blonde with blue eyes, tall and slender, to flutter onto the platform and embrace her. Revelle Balmain lives in the prestigious Sydney suburb of Bellevue Hill, not far from the city center. She is a model and a dancer. She had planned to visit her parents before a work trip to Japan, where her troupe awaited her for their 4th tour. But there is much that Jan doesn't know about her daughter, and on this November day, Revelle does not disembark in Newcastle. Traces of her short life are scattered across Sydney's streets, including items intended to accompany her to Japan, a journey she will never make. 22-year-old Revelle Balmain was close to realizing her dream. As a professional dancer, she had already visited Japan on 3 concert tours and eagerly anticipated her 4th trip. She supplemented her income by modeling, appearing in magazine spreads and product advertisements. Just a few days later, a new issue of a popular Australian magazine featuring Revelle on the cover was scheduled for release, an esteemed accomplishment for a model. Additionally, 4 weeks ago, Revelle met a promising 27-year-old director named Piers Fisher-Pollard. Young, beautiful, and talented, Revelle had high expectations for life, and it seemed like her entire life lay ahead of her. Revelle started dancing at the age of 3. She adored music, jazz, and tap dancing. During her teenage years, she spent a year in a theater school in Britain. However, upon returning from her first concert tour, she realized that performing on stage was her true calling. Unfortunately, it didn't pay as well as she'd hoped, so she juggled dancing with modeling jobs. But even that wasn't enough to cover her bills. Therefore, she decided to improve her financial situation by offering her services to an escort agency. Many girls work in this field for a very short time, facing difficulties, and she was one of them. Much later, Revelle's mother would state that her daughter's decision shocked her family. She had grown up in a loving family, always supportive of their children, and if financial troubles arose, she could have turned to them. The woman speculated that the deeply hidden reason for this decision might have been related to an incident when Revelle was 4 years old and found her 1.5-year-old brother Matthew floating in the pool. He couldn't be saved, and it was very difficult for her parents to recover from this. Perhaps Revelle never managed to overcome it. Nevertheless, in November 1994, Revelle's boyfriend, family, and most of her friends had no idea about her side job. Saturday, November 5th, 1994, was supposed to be her last day working in escort services. At some point, her life took a turn, but after 6 weeks of leading a double life, she was returning to her true love and passion, dance. The day before, she had lunch with her friend Kate Brentnall, who described her as happier than she had ever been. She was very excited about her trip to Japan. Revelle had dyed her hair to a softer, more natural blonde. I thought it was symbolic. I thought she had never looked more beautiful. Sadly, that journey would never take place, because the next evening she disappeared under highly suspicious circumstances. Revelle spent Saturday morning with Piers. In the short time they had been dating, they had become inseparable. However, suddenly Piers developed an intense headache, forcing them to go to the hospital. After seeing the doctor, Revelle suggested having lunch, but Piers declined due to his migraine. Around noon, he escorted her to a bus stop. Revelle headed to the city center while Piers preferred to lie down. At that time, Revelle was working for 2 different escort agencies. One of them was managed by Jane Stanojevic and Zoran Stanojevic. As her boyfriend, Piers, couldn't spend time with her, Revelle called Jane and Zoran's escort agency to inform them that she was available. The administrator replied that she had a 2-hour booking from 4 p.m. It was for a new client, a young man named Gavin Samer, who lived in the eastern suburb of Sydney called Kingsford. Later at 10 p.m., she had another appointment with friends of Zoran from Serbia. Zoran was eager to please his friends and suggested having her accompany them to the hotel because he wanted to offer them the most beautiful girl. Revelle arrived at Gavin Samer's house with a bottle of champagne as requested by Gavin. She was wearing cork wedge shoes, a long skirt, and a tunic. She had a pager. During that time, there were no mobile phones, so escort agencies handed pagers to the girls, sending them messages as new orders came in. At 3:50 p.m., Revelle used Gavin's phone to call the administrator and let them know she had arrived. This was a way for the girl to signal that she felt comfortable at the client's house and that everything was fine. 2 hours later at 5:50 p.m., she called the administrator again and said the meeting was over and she was leaving, but there was no need to send a driver for her. However, as Gavin later revealed, she didn't leave, but instead arranged to spend an extra hour with him for additional payment. This was a risky practice because the owners of the escort agencies did not approve and sometimes punished the girls for such side jobs, naturally because they didn't receive their share of the profit. While she was with Gavin, her boyfriend Pierce messaged her, feeling much better. She told him she'd lay down to rest. Pierce easily believed this as he had no suspicion about her side job. At 7 p.m., she received a message on her pager from her friend Kate Brittle. 15 minutes later, Revelle called back and let her friend know she couldn't talk, but would call from home in an hour after changing, and then they would have a couple of beers together at the Royal Hotel, a popular pub in Sydney. Afterward, she planned to meet Pierce. The sun set that day at 7:25 p.m. according to Gavin. That was the last time he saw Revelle when he dropped her off at the nearest pub, the Tomato Inn. He pulled up to the pub, she got out of the car, said goodbye, and entered through the back door. Gavin then went to a store for cigarettes and cider before heading home, watching TV, and going to bed. At 7:53 p.m., Revelle's boyfriend Pierce sent her another message on her pager, but she didn't reply. By this time, Pierce had met their mutual friend Zoe. They were visiting different bars in the city, and Pierce constantly messaged Revelle on her pager so she'd know where to find them. The last time he attempted to contact her was at 2:30 a.m. Then he went home to sleep. She didn't respond to any of his messages. On the following day, November 6th, Revelle's mother, Jen Belmain, stood on the railway platform in Newcastle, awaiting the arrival of the train from Sydney, on which her daughter was supposed to arrive. Revelle's parents were eagerly anticipating their daughter's arrival to have a sort of farewell celebratory dinner, to catch up, chat, share the latest news before she was due to embark on a 2-week rehearsal in Brisbane, followed by her troupe's upcoming 4-month tour in Japan. The train arrived, but Revelle wasn't on it. Jen assumed that her daughter might have missed the early morning train and waited for the next one. However, Revelle still didn't appear. As time passed, Jen realized that something was amiss. She returned home and immediately made phone calls. She contacted her daughter's friend, the apartment neighbor, and hospitals in Sydney, trying to ascertain her whereabouts. When Revelle's apartment neighbor informed Jen that Revelle's room still had an almost fully packed suitcase with her belongings, passport, and ticket to Japan, Jen realized it was time to involve the police. Jen, along with Revelle's apartment neighbor and her boyfriend Pierce, reported Revelle missing. However, the police were not swift in commencing an investigation, despite the discovery of Revelle's belongings scattered throughout the Kingsford area, where her last client, Gavin Seymour, resided. Her bag, cosmetics, diary, credit cards, and keys to the Bellevue Hill apartment were found strewn across different streets. One of her high heels was found in a trash bin, while the other was discovered in a nearby block. The plastic casing of her pager was lying in a gutter. On the 5th day after the girl's disappearance, when everything indicated an unfortunate event involving Revelle, the police started their investigation. Initially, they explored the version that Revelle was abducted on the streets of Kingsford, with the abductor throwing her belongings out of the car window while driving. Wild rumors circulated, suggesting she might have been abducted at the request of an Arabian prince and taken to Saudi Arabia. However, the police attempted to investigate more realistic scenarios. Pierce was the first to be excluded from the list of suspects. Investigators considered the possibility that he might have learned about the girl's double life and became so furious that he killed Revelle. However, when informed about her side jobs, it was a double blow for the young man. He had an alibi for the evening of her disappearance, and apart from her family, a few friends, and her roommate, he was one of the few people who insisted on continuing the investigation, demanding a more serious approach to the case. Next in line as a suspect was Gavin. Several suspicious moments arose in his story. He recounted that on that Saturday, when he decided to engage the services of the escort agency, his girlfriend Michelle had left home to visit her family. He hired Revelle and paid her $500 for 3 hours. To pay Revelle, he pawned Michelle's clarinet and received $250 for it. Additionally, he won $150 at slot machines in the Tomato Inn pub. This summed up to $400. He paid this in cash and another $100 to Revelle by check. However, the pub staff couldn't recall cashing out his winnings, and he allegedly lost his family's checkbook. Even in the store where he bought cigarettes and cider, there were no records corresponding to the man's claims. His girlfriend Michelle was, of course, questioned. She flew from Brisbane to Sydney 2 days after Revelle's disappearance. Gavin met her at the airport, and she immediately noticed scratches on Gavin's chest and neck. There was also a mark on his finger, as if from a bite. The police also noticed these wounds, but Gavin couldn't explain where they came from, whether from surfing activities or gardening. Michelle also pointed out that Gavin cleaned his car and folded the rear seats, although she added that he often turned the car into a mess, then cleaned it to accommodate his surfboard. Additionally, her incredibly lazy boyfriend laundered the bedding and hung it out to dry just before her arrival. She found it suspicious, but it likely indicated his attempt to hide infidelity rather than criminal activity. Unfortunately, due to the lack of evidence, the police couldn't even conclusively prove that a crime had occurred. The Revelle parents were determined to seek justice for their daughter, but no one was arrested or charged with anything. A member of the Revelle family claimed that the police considered Revelle's life less valuable because she was promiscuous, hence they half-heartedly conducted the investigation. Gavin's house was searched not immediately after the girl's disappearance, and even then, it was done without a warrant. It was more of a cursory inspection. Gavin's car was checked for DNA and other evidence only after 10 days. Many crucial witnesses were not interviewed and evidence was not gathered. Naturally, the investigation stalled, and there were no developments in it for several years. Only in 1999, after an active campaign by the public, media, and the girl's relatives, did interest in the case resurface, and it was reviewed by the coroner. The detective who led the initial investigation told the coroner that, in the police's opinion, Gavin was the prime suspect in the case. Even Gavin's lawyer, Seymour, was forced to agree that his client was the sole suspect. Gavin worked for the girl's parents' company and at the time was an attractive, successful young man. Additionally, he was quite athletic as he loved surfing. Gavin lived with his girlfriend, Michelle, but when she went to visit her family, he decided to hire an escort. Gavin was the last person seen with Revelle. According to him, she spent an additional hour with him before he dropped her off at the Red Tomato Inn, a pub in Kingsford. He parked his car in the back. Revelle exited the car, said goodbye, and walked inside through the back door. He then went to a store and headed home. However, nobody at the pub who was present at that time could recall seeing Revelle. The owner explicitly stated that they had a different crowd that evening, and if such a girl had entered the pub, everyone would have noticed. Despite Gavin purchasing cider at the store, no one remembered this. In other words, after Revelle's last call to her friend from Gavin's house at 7:15 p.m., nothing from Gavin's account was officially confirmed. Moreover, Michelle, now his ex-girlfriend, told the coroner in 1999 that she called Gavin that evening but got no answer. After several attempts, she finally got through at 9:22 p.m. and he sounded agitated. His other ex-girlfriend, who had been involved with him before, stated that after drinking, he could become aggressive and hit her in the face. This raised suspicions further, especially because Gavin had been drinking on Saturday throughout the day and had at least consumed half a bottle of champagne brought by Revelle. However, one witness, a young man named Jeremy Coughlin, offered a completely different scenario of what might have happened to Revelle. Jeremy was a friend of one of Revelle's wealthiest clients, Mark Colton. Jeremy recounted that he and Mark were at a party when, after a few drinks, Mark abruptly said, "Aren't people stupid? Have you heard about Revelle Bellarmine? First, there were rumors about an Arab prince who took her to Saudi Arabia. Nonsense. She's at a depth of 3 meters and nobody will find her body. That's what you get for deceiving the brothel you work for. The brothel owner wanted her dead because she was damaging his business." Jeremy asked his friend about Mark's relationship with Revelle, and he replied that he met her outside the brothel, paying her between $500 to $1,000 a week, which was cheaper than paying the agency $200 per hour. When Mark Colton was questioned, he denied saying anything like that, but he indeed had heard rumors that agencies were threatening employees who saw clients privately. Owners of the agency were also questioned. It turned out that on Revelle's last day working at the escort agency, she owed Jane and Zoran money, around $300. However, as explained by Jane, this wasn't considered unusual. While most clients pay with credit cards, some prefer cash, and at the end of each week, the girls in the agency reconcile who owes what to whom. According to Jane, Revelle was planning to repay the money owing to a meeting with Zoran's friends scheduled for 10 p.m. However, Zoran claimed he was unaware of such an agreement. In fact, his words contradicted those of his wife on almost every point. Jane described that on the day the girl disappeared, she and Zoran bought a television, had pizza at a pizzeria around 5 p.m., and went home. She didn't work that night because she was heavily pregnant and tired. However, Zoran told the police he didn't work on the evening of the girl's disappearance, literally saying, "No, not on Saturday." He claimed he took the TV to the office, installed it, and returned home around 7 p.m. Yet, 4 years later, during the coroner's inquest, he stated that by saying, "No, not on Saturday," he meant not during the day on Saturday. In reality, he did work that evening and returned home around 2 a.m. He blamed the misunderstanding on the translator. However, later, a linguistic expert confirmed that the original statements of the man were translated correctly. Regardless, Zoran claimed he did not see Revelle that night. As the agency's driver, he picked up another girl, Kelly, at 7:15 p.m. He took her to meet his friends at Royal Hotel Park in Darling Harbour, where he waited for 2 hours before driving her to another appointment at the Sheraton Airport Hotel. When he was taking the girl home, he had a flat tire, which he had to fix himself. For 4 years following the girl's disappearance and before the case was considered by the coroner, the police did not interview either Zoran's Serbian friends, who had long since left for Belgrade, or Kelly, Revelle's colleague, who provided Zoran's alibi. Partly this was because when Jane Stanojevic gave her initial statement in 1994, she said that Revelle was supposed to meet the Serbians at the Swiss Grand Hotel in Bondi. After 4 years, she claimed she had made a mistake and actually meant the Park Royal Hotel in Darling Harbour. It wasn't until 1999 that the police checked the registration records of both hotels, finding no information about the Serbians in either. Only after Zoran's testimony did the police locate Kelly, who reluctantly corroborated his words. However, when the police checked the Sheraton Hotel records, they couldn't find evidence of Kelly or her client being there. Gavin Seymour, the lawyer, was puzzled as to why the girl was miraculously found only now, why she wasn't questioned 4 years ago, and why the police didn't investigate inconsistencies between Zoran's and his wife's statements, which couldn't even agree on whether he was working on November 5th, 1994. In response to all these questions, the chief investigator who led the initial investigation said that he didn't know. The Revelle family was deeply upset by what they heard during the coroner's inquest. The police failed to interview many crucial witnesses, and other witnesses, of course, had long forgotten what they had seen over such a period of time. Their lawyer stated that the girl's parents were treated as a nuisance, despite their only desire being to know what happened to their daughter. Didn't they deserve that? Even the coroner was forced to agree that the initial investigation wasn't as thorough as it should have been. After examining the case, the coroner dismissed the theory that Revelle staged her own disappearance because there was no evidence to support it. After all, if she wanted to disappear, the timing was extremely inconvenient. She was already planning an extended trip to Japan and would have returned to pursue her career as a model and dancer with renewed vigor, making her short stint as a call girl forgettable. Additionally, her personal life seemed perfect. She and Piers were crazy about each other, and there was nothing indicating that she wanted to run away. On May 28, 1999, the coroner ruled that Revelle was murdered on November 5, 1994, by an unknown person or persons. He noted that there wasn't sufficient evidence against the police's main suspect, Gavin Seymour. However, if his name had been hidden from the public eye until then, now everyone knew who was considered the prime suspect in the case. Before the coroner ruled that Revelle was murdered, the police had no body or evidence to work with. It was only in 2008 that detectives from the cold case unit sent forensic experts to Gavin's house, due to advancements in technology. Subsequently, detectives went to Tasmania to question Gavin, but he refused to provide DNA. Gavin, once a successful young man, moved to Tasmania and worked as a chef due to being essentially accused without trial of Revelle's murder. He led a very secluded life, drank heavily, and hardly interacted with locals. After spending 15 years there, he returned to Sydney in 2018. He only spoke to a journalist once, explaining that the case had cost him job opportunities and felt as though he was punished without being proven guilty. He knew people considered him guilty, but he claimed innocence. In reality, he was more preoccupied with how the case affected him than Revelle and her loved ones. However, he stated he didn't kill Revelle. He was only guilty of hiring a call girl that day. Revelle's parents passed away without receiving answers about their daughter. What happened to her? Who killed her and why? Her sister still hopes the case will progress. Over the years, she searched for her sister's body. Now, she seeks answers. She needs to know who killed Revelle. It seems her prayers were answered because in 2021, a new phase of the investigation began. The police announced a reward of $1 million for information leading to Revelle's killer's arrest. Additionally, Jane King, former owner of the escort agency and Zoran's ex-wife, made an incredible statement. She said she never thought Gavin Seymour could be involved in Revelle's disappearance. However, she now had new evidence supporting Gavin's truth, evidence that would help clear his name but was not found by the police conducting the initial investigation. Essentially, his whereabouts that evening were confirmed. That's all she could disclose at the moment. This new information turned the investigation upside down. In fact, a series of new facts were discovered in the case, crucial enough to be presented to the coroner in February next year. Yes, it took almost 30 years, but the police identified clear contradictions that shifted the entire focus of the investigation. While old evidence still needs testing with new technologies, the new investigation is focused on Jane's ex-husband Zoran and his constantly changing story. He was one of the main drivers for the company, transporting girls to clients. However, there were always discrepancies in the statements he gave to the police. During the initial interrogation, 10 days after Revelle's disappearance, he claimed he wasn't working that night, but was at home with his wife. In 1999, he admitted to being at work, but his new version of events still didn't align because the evidence crucial to his alibi was not found. Revelle was supposed to meet Zoran's Serbian friends at 10 p.m., but for some reason, the police never questioned them. Incredibly, in 2021, an anonymous call was made to an organization called Crime Stoppers regarding this man, in the photo, who could be involved in the crime. This likely refers to Bojan Prevalovic, Zoran's friend and Revelle's last presumed client. While Jane King never met her husband's friend, she now knows that Zoran arranged something for him the day after the girl's disappearance. He bought a ticket from Australia to Thailand. Essentially, the man Revelle was supposed to meet that evening left the country the very next day after her disappearance, and no one bothered to inquire about the reason for such haste or coincidence. In December 2021, a raid was conducted on Zoran's property, revealing cannabis worth $400,000 and exclusive items valued at $150,000. He faced 36 charges and was denied bail. Most importantly, according to the police, the raids were carried out based on information obtained during the new investigation into Revelle Belmain's disappearance and presumed murder. A detective explicitly stated they were investigating Zoran's involvement in the crime. However, if Zoran's behavior appears unusual, no less suspicious are the actions of Jane King herself. On the day Revelle disappeared, she and Zoran had lunch at a pizza place. The next morning, upon learning that Revelle wasn't answering calls or messages, Jane immediately dialed the pizza place's number. A staff member recalls her being in a panic, as if it were crucial for her to secure an alibi. She allegedly said to the staff member, "The police are investigating a murder. Can you confirm that we were at your restaurant?" Jane denies phrasing it this way. She insists she said disappearance. But regardless of whether she said murder or disappearance, why was she in such a hurry to confirm her alibi on the very day Revelle, a grown 22-year-old woman, had disappeared just a few hours ago? Where did this rush come from? Why was she so certain that Revelle simply missed her last evening order, given that such occurrences had been noted before? Jane King herself hadn't even called the police at that point. Likely, nobody had yet contacted the police, and certainly nobody was conducting an investigation. It seems she was certain that she would be asked where she was that day. One can't help but suspect that Jane and Zoran know more than they want to reveal. At the very least, people who definitely knew where Revelle was that evening, apart from her last client, were the escort agency administrator, Jane King, and Zoran Stanovic. The new police investigation leading to the second coroner's inquest, planned for early next year, is in defiance of the apparent difficulties posed by the time elapsed since Revelle Belmain's disappearance. However, it currently promises the greatest hope that this dreadful case will be solved. Today, detectives are closer than ever to capturing her killer. A woman, walking or running alone on a trail. This image is often associated with a dense forest. where a thin, winding path leads deeper into it and rays of light barely penetrate through the thick tree canopy. It's a place where an unsuspecting victim could be dragged off the trail, and nobody would hear her scream. But what if it's a sun-drenched, highly popular pathway located right in the heart of the city, where people stroll almost at any time? The attack on Katie Lorek happened precisely in such a wonderfully safe place. And that's the scariest part, because it confirms that a nightmare can become a reality in an instant. And something like this could happen to any one of us. Kathleen Louise Ayello Lorek, known as Katie, was born in New Mexico but grew up in California, where she met her future husband, Jeffrey Lyon. The young couple got married and they had 3 children, but despite 20 years together, the family eventually fell apart. Their divorce was a challenging process and was officially finalized in 1997. However, it turned out to be beneficial for the 44-year-old woman. Her friend recalls that Katie had always been a lively person, but after the divorce, she simply blossomed. Over the next 3 years, Katie advanced in her career, working as an assistant in Sistren Donner in Concord, California. It was a very successful and prominent company, and Katie held a high position in the office. A new, wonderful chapter began in her life. Her children were almost grown, she loved her job, and she started dating again. Despite being over 40, due to her excellent physical condition, grooming, and joyful attitude toward life, she attracted a lot of attention. At work, Katie introduced her son to one of her colleagues. The man's name was Johannes Lorek. There was an instant spark between them, and with Johannes, Katie felt she could be herself. They started dating, although their meetings were not very frequent because Johannes lived in Austria. However, they traveled together, had romantic weekends, and enjoyed skiing. In 2003, during a trip to a lake in Switzerland where they had gone for a skiing excursion, Johannes knelt down and asked Katie to marry him. She would have been happy to spend the rest of her life with Johannes, and just a few weeks later he came to the United States and they got married. The couple planned to live in Austria. After all, there was nothing truly tying the woman to the States. Her sons and daughter had grown up and supported her new relationship. Everyone who knew Katie wanted her to be happy, and it seemed like everything was heading that way in her marriage to Johannes. Meanwhile, Katie worked her last few weeks at the company, where her colleagues had practically become her family members. She was always ready to help her colleagues, genuinely concerned about each one of them, and was highly appreciated for it. However, no matter how open and caring Katie was, even she needed a breather. Her respite became the daily walks along a trail that started behind the parking lot of her office. During every lunch break, she would put on comfortable sport shoes and stroll along a trail slightly over 20 kilometers long. The Contra Costa Canal Trail passes through several residential neighborhoods, offices, and is surrounded by moderately dense but perfectly suitable greenery for walks. Besides enjoying the fresh air, Katie valued this time because she could make personal calls, especially to her husband. In Austria, it was around 9 o'clock in the evening, making it comfortable for the spouses to communicate. So, on Tuesday, May 13, 2003, colleagues saw Katie as usual at 12:40 p.m. She kicked off her office shoes, put on her sneakers, and left the office, just as she did every weekday. One might think that taking a solitary walk along a trail amidst shrubbery could be risky for an attractive woman, and in case of any danger, nobody would hear her scream. But this specific trail was nothing like that. Not only did it pass by residential homes and businesses, but people were constantly walking, jogging, walking dogs, and biking along it. It was nearly impossible to find a time during midday when the trail was deserted, yet someone managed to do so. Katie was deeply engaged in a conversation with her husband when he heard her either muffle a scream or sharply inhale before the phone disconnected. Johannes tried calling his wife back, assuming she might have simply stumbled and dropped her phone, but all calls went to voicemail. He knew Katie would call back, understanding that her abrupt end to the conversation might worry him, so he called her office to alert her colleagues. By that time, they were already concerned. Katie was punctual to the minute, and when she didn't return after lunch, they began searching for her. Johannes's call further troubled them. They knew what needed to be done. It was around 3 p.m. when the police were notified of Katie Lorek's disappearance. Credit must be given to the police. They didn't take the disappearance of an adult woman lightly and responded promptly. Just a few minutes after the call to the police, they dispatched officers to the trail since colleagues mentioned she should be there. The officers searched for her on foot, on motorcycles, and called in K9 units. The dog indeed led the K9 unit in the same direction the missing woman used to enjoy walking, so the officers knew they were on the right track. But how could she simply vanish in broad daylight? The search quickly led the K9 unit to a bloody trail on the pathway. It wasn't just a few drops, it was a very distinct trail, as if an injured person had been dragged from the trail into the bushes, but that wasn't all they found. A sneaker caught their eye, lying nearby in a pool of blood. Then they saw the body of a woman lying in the mud. She was in a small depression, covered in blood, her hair matted with it. She was naked, with a bra featuring an animal print lying on the grass nearby, along with black leggings, another sneaker, and a jacket. It seemed as though someone had forcibly removed items of clothing from the victim in a hurried manner. It was evident to the officers that the attack had turned violent, a brutal assault on an unprotected woman. Police immediately checked for signs of life in Katie, and despite all the injuries, it turned out she was still alive. The arriving paramedics swiftly transported her to the nearest hospital within minutes. Her condition was extremely fragile, and they were determined to help her. But at 4:54 p.m., they were compelled to pronounce Katie Lorek deceased. Once Katie was taken to the hospital, the forensic specialists aimed to preserve as much evidence as possible, but it was already too late. When it was discovered that Katie was still alive, the medical team worked urgently to save her life, and therefore they couldn't act cautiously to preserve evidence. They cannot be blamed. It's essential to prioritize saving the life of the victim in such cases. Consequently, some evidence was compromised. However, the police almost immediately discovered something crucial: the weapon used in the crime. It turned out to be a part of a fence post. It was taken from the section of the barrier that had long been rusted. They surmised that whoever the perpetrator was, they had broken off a part of the post just before the attack. Perhaps the crime was impulsive rather than planned. Therefore, nobody paid attention to the strange object in the assailant's hands, as it seemed harmless. While Katie was on the phone with her husband, she didn't see someone approaching or running up behind her. The attacker repeatedly struck her on the head. At least one blow must have caused her to weaken or lose consciousness, preventing her from screaming, and the assailant had the opportunity to drag her into the bushes without resistance. The murder weapon was covered in blood and was found next to the pool of blood where Katie was discovered. The forensic expert concluded that Katie died from head injuries. However, before that, the killer spent quite some time with her, committing various acts of violence. He left his semen on her body and skin particles on the murder weapon, which allowed the experts to retrieve his DNA. The DNA was cross-checked with the database, but there were no matches. After spending 2 hours at the crime scene, officers realized something was missing. Katie was on the phone during the attack. So where was her phone? It turned out the phone was on, and a ping led the police to an apartment building where 23-year-old Juan Sanchez lived. However, if investigators thought they would quickly arrest the suspect and close the case, it wasn't so simple. The young man explained that he was biking on the trail when he stumbled upon the phone without its owner nearby, so he assumed it was okay to take it. Juan showed the police where he found the gadget, and it was right near the crime scene. His words were trustworthy but not entirely convincing. He was asked to provide a DNA sample, and he readily agreed. Preemptively, it soon became clear that Juan was telling the truth. His DNA did not match the sample. He had merely found the victim's phone and was not the killer. However, since DNA comparison was going to take some time, the police delved into Katie's life. In such a fierce attack, the perpetrator is usually someone known to the victim, especially if the victim is a woman. First and foremost, detectives focused on Katie's ex-husband. What if the woman's second marriage had triggered jealousy and rage in him? However, despite the difficult divorce, there were no signs of animosity between the former spouses. Furthermore, Jeffrey had an alibi which ruled him out as a suspect. Before marrying Johannes, Katie was dating another man who lived in Germany, but on the day of the murder, he happened to be in the city due to interesting circumstances. Moreover, Katie had met him just 2 days before her death. Yet again, they couldn't link the man to the crime scene or establish a motive. What if the new man in the woman's life was responsible for her death? It wouldn't be the first time a man didn't want to be tied down by the bonds of marriage, but wasn't content with a divorce either. Usually money becomes a factor, such as insurance. Certainly, Johannes was thousands of kilometers away from his wife and spoke to her on the phone. On the other hand, he knew her schedule better than anyone, knew where she would be and at what time. Could he have hired a hitman? However, the murder weapon indicated that it was a spontaneous, not a planned crime. Besides, a hitman would likely have tried to flee the crime scene as quickly as possible rather than tormenting the woman. Everything suggested that the victim and the killer hadn't been acquainted before the incident. Therefore, detectives doubled their efforts to find witnesses who might have noticed something unusual on the trail that day. People recalled walking there themselves or with their pets, going to work, riding bikes. One cyclist remembered a stranger asking him for a cigarette. Overall, it seemed like an ordinary day, not hinting at anything out of the ordinary. Despite the shock that something like this had happened on the trail where they felt safe every day, a few witnesses remembered a man acting strangely. He was pointing at the canal, showing fish, as if trying to attract the attention of passers-by. Two unrelated individuals asked to collaborate with an artist and ended up producing two remarkably realistic and similar composite sketches of this man. The only difference was the sunglasses that the man had on his head. The composite sketches were publicized in the media, and the public was asked for assistance. This prompted hundreds of calls from people eager to help. Furthermore, a reward was offered for assistance in apprehending the killer, $10,000 promised by the police, along with an additional $25,000 offered by Katie's company. The police compared the composite sketches with photos of local men who had been arrested for displaying aggression. The more they looked, the more they believed they had found a suspect, a man who lived in the area and was known to frequent the trail. He had been arrested for minor offenses and for assaulting a judge. His name was John Kaler, a 32-year-old. John was a mechanic who suffered from several mental health issues. He had several offenses on his record, mostly related to driving under the influence and an impulsive attack on a judge right inside the courthouse. At that time, he was in handcuffs and was immediately pulled away from the judge, but the attack was documented. There were no other aggressive actions, especially towards women, registered against him. However, he was remarkably similar to the composite sketches. Additionally, the search efforts lost track specifically on the street where John lived. The police were convinced that this wasn't just a coincidence and that they had apprehended the killer. They even called Katie's relatives and informed them that they had found the prime suspect. Now, they needed to detain him as carefully as possible. The police arrived at John's father's house where he resided. His sister answered their knock. She confirmed they were at the right address, but John was no longer available to talk. John had died. On May 14th, the day after the investigation began, John went to the Golden Gate Bridge and jumped. The police were allowed to search the house. They found another piece of evidence supporting their theory, a pair of sunglasses identical to those in the composite sketch. They discovered clothing with something resembling bloodstains on it, and in John's room there was a newspaper article about Katie's murder, along with the composite sketches of the suspect. What was the police supposed to think? Could this be a coincidence? It seemed like John had committed the crime, realized the police would be onto him soon, and decided to end everything by going to the bridge. The police were confident that they closed the case within 72 hours. The man's body was in the morgue. All they needed was to take his DNA and compare it to the sample found on Katie Lorek. Witnesses identified John Keller from a photograph as the man on the trail that day. The DNA check became merely a formality. Confident in their righteousness, the officers declared to the media that the case was solved and proclaimed that the cruel murderer and rapist, John Keller, had been identified. Journalists descended upon the man's relatives, demanding answers to their questions and not allowing them to mourn their son and brother peacefully. In response, they criticized the detectives for not waiting for the DNA comparison results. John Keller's sister and father were convinced that the police were mistaken. His father stated that it was irresponsible to connect several random facts and fit them into a picture of the murder. They destroyed the reputation of a young man that was already tarnished. "It's unthinkable," he said. The family was distraught. John could no longer defend himself, and they tried to do it for him. John's father underwent a polygraph test to prove that his son was at home at the time of the crime. The polygraph showed that he was telling the truth. A month passed, Katie was buried, and the police were no longer actively investigating, simply waiting for the DNA test results. And finally, that day arrived. The samples didn't match. John hadn't assaulted or killed Katie. It was a massive blow to the investigators. Not only did they lose a month of investigation, but they also intensified the pain of John's family, who had lost a son and brother. Moreover, even after receiving the DNA test results, they didn't inform the public and only acknowledged the truth after John's father's statements. They stubbornly continued to claim that he might be somehow connected to the case. That's when the Keller family offered their own reward of $5,000 to anyone with information about Katie's murder, because they wanted to clear their son's name once and for all. Police took DNA samples from at least 50 men, acquaintances of Katie or resembling the composite sketch, but no matches were found. Then, after 4 months, a breakthrough occurred in the case. Early in the investigation, when questioning witnesses, one man mentioned that during the time frame the police were interested in, he was biking on the trail and stopped to smoke. A stranger approached and asked for a cigarette. The stranger smoked 2 cigarettes and the cyclist smoked 1. They chatted briefly, and that was the end of it. This happened about 60 meters from where Katie was found. The police decided to follow up on this lead, although it had been a week since the crime. They found a spot with 3 cigarette butts on the ground. Fortunately, they hadn't been rained on, and after 4 months the DNA comparison result came back. The stranger who asked the witness for a cigarette was the rapist and murderer. But now the challenge was how to find him. The only hope lay in the memory of the cyclist. Miraculously, after 4 months, he recalled that the man worked in the telephone marketing field in a neighboring town. There was only one such company in that town, so armed with composite sketches, because that's all they had, the police went there. Employees immediately recognized 38-year-old Robert Ward Fraser in the images. However, he hadn't shown up for work since May, almost immediately after Katie's body was discovered. They couldn't locate him at his address. His former girlfriend confirmed that he had left a long time ago and presumed he might have returned to his hometown, but she wasn't certain. However, she found something useful for the police: Robert's toothbrush. Again, a DNA test would take time, and it wouldn't hurt to investigate the suspect for the time being. The man had a history of legal issues, having been arrested 9 times, particularly for robberies and related to illegal substances. He was known for his aggressive behavior in prison. He closely matched the witnesses' descriptions, and an arrest warrant had been issued in Indiana for violating parole conditions. Contacting the Indiana police, the Concord, California officers couldn't believe their luck when they were informed that Robert had tried to return to his hometown and was naturally arrested. Detectives flew from California to Indiana to talk to him. During the interrogation, the man was relaxed, slouched in his chair, joked, and didn't resemble someone afraid of anything. He confirmed that he lived in California, was near the crime scene, and smoked cigarettes with a cyclist around the time of the murder. Robert admitted he heard about Katie Lorek's case on TV. But when the police clarified if he remembered what the woman looked like, he answered that she had long hair, seemed to be a brunette, and guessed that she had freckles. Caught, thought the officers, he provided information that only the killer could have known. Katie did indeed have freckles, but they were not visible in any of the photos shown in the news. The freckles were not on her face, especially since she used makeup, not on her hands, but on the woman's chest. More precisely, between her breasts, meaning only someone who had seen her naked could know about it. And he couldn't have just guessed that. Detectives informed Robert that they had the perpetrator's DNA, to which he started talking about relieving himself in the bushes. In other words, he chose the same spot as the rapist. However, semen was found on Katie, which was an entirely different story. Robert's defense began to crumble, and the detective tried to press him, showing him the bloodiest photo of the victim and asking what she had done to deserve such a thing. Robert claimed he didn't want to see it and that he was not guilty. He sounded quite convincing. The suspect refused to communicate further without a lawyer, but his confession wasn't necessary. His DNA was taken, and it matched the DNA on Katie and on the murder weapon. Witnesses identified Robert as the person they saw on the trail. He was charged with violence, sodomy, and first-degree murder. He faced the death penalty or life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The trial took place in May 2006. The prosecutor systematically walked the jury through the events of that day. Robert came to the trail with intentions to satisfy his most base desires. He chose Katie because at that moment there were no witnesses on the trail. He grabbed the first weapon he found and attacked the woman, who was talking to her husband on the phone and was unaware of the danger. The prosecutor stated that what we don't know and will never know is how Katie experienced her last moments of life. She is not here with us to tell whether she begged, cried, pleaded for her life, or if she was even conscious after the first blow while the assailant continued to torment her. He then killed the woman, all for a few moments of pleasure. The defense attorneys tried to save the defendant's life. telling the story of his childhood suffering from both physical and psychological violence. However, he was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. He awaits the execution of the sentence at San Quentin. In 1989, the industrial growth in the American state of Indiana allowed certain businesses to reach unprecedented heights, with businessmen reaping the benefits. John Parker was one of them. John started working at a very young age. As a teenager, he took a job at a restaurant clearing dishes from tables. However, this was not enough for the ambitious young man, and he ventured into selling vacuum cleaners. Going door-to-door selling vacuum cleaners doesn't usually earn much. Even his own family mocked John's choice. The laughter stopped when, just a few months later, the 19-year-old broke all sales records. It seemed like he went from nothing to a super successful person overnight, but that wasn't the case. John worked tirelessly for his goals, putting in 12 to 16 hours a day. Despite his hard work, he wasn't selfish and willingly shared his knowledge and experience to inspire colleagues to excel in their work. Confident and very charismatic, the young man moved to Michigan, where he opened his own vacuum cleaner sales center. The wave of success brought 20-year-old Judy Hicks to his shore. Judy was self-assured and assertive, but she had to be. Unlike John, who grew up in a middle-class family, Judy knew poverty. She married very young and became a mother of 2 children, Christina and Danny. However, her married life didn't work out, and after the divorce, to make ends meet and take care of her children, she also decided to start selling vacuum cleaners. John helped her, first as a colleague, then as a lover. The closer they became, the more successful the business developed. Judy became his right-hand woman. Every time he gave a speech, John started by saying he wouldn't have achieved anything without Judy. The couple married at the end of 1992 and opened a training center for other sales professionals, J&J Parker Industries. By the age of 30, John became a millionaire, and his family grew with 2 more daughters, Tiffany and Erica. Christina and Danny also called John their dad, spent a lot of time at the office with their parents, and it was impossible to tell that John wasn't the biological father of the older children. The family led a deliberately luxurious lifestyle. This was one of John's philosophies, to radiate success so that his employees would also strive for success. He was an idol of the youth of that generation. However, after 10 years of marriage, many things changed. John, once a cheerful and content man, turned into a bundle of nerves. However, not without reason. His wife cheated on him with their colleague. John became suspicious and installed several surveillance cameras at work, which confirmed his wife's affair. It was a severe blow to his ego. He started drinking. Judy begged him to hand over the incriminating video, but John refused. It would give him a significant advantage in divorce proceedings. However, he had no intention of divorcing. As he jokingly told a friend, it's cheaper to keep her, so John decided to take his wife as far away from her lover as possible. The family returned to Indiana and settled in the prestigious neighborhood of Crown Point. John opened an office in Merrillville, Indiana, and disbanded the office staff in Michigan. He brought with him only his most loyal employees, including his trusted confidant, Ben. John brought Ben from Michigan and began training him in everything so that when he decided to step back from business, it would continue to thrive. Together, they built a business empire and seemed to be living better than they could have ever imagined. However, on Thursday, April 17, 2003, the emergency services received 2 calls reporting an armed attack in the warehouse district where John Parker's company office was located. The calls came from John's wife, Judy Parker, and his manager, Ben. When the police arrived, they first searched the entire area, including dumpsters and rooftops, in case the suspect was hiding somewhere. Finding no one, they returned to the crime scene and to John Parker, as he turned out to be the victim. His car was parked in front of the office, and he was found lying on the ground with a single bullet hole in the back of his head. The gunshot wound was fatal. A casing from a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol was found nearby the body. What surprised investigators was that a second identical casing was found some distance away from the victim. The man's wallet was missing from his pocket, and at first glance, it appeared to be a botched robbery. While the medical examiner took the body for autopsy, investigators had to find out from Ben and Judy what they had seen. In Judy's account, she behaved unusually calmly, which the detectives attributed to shock. She explained that in the evening, she and her husband had dinner at a local restaurant while their 4 children stayed home watching a movie. One of their younger daughters, Tiffany, had been misbehaving at school, and the couple wanted to discuss discipline for her. The next day was the start of spring break, so it was clear the girl would be spending all her days at home. At some point, their daughter Christina called and said that Tiffany had left her homework in the office, so the couple stopped by to pick it up. While John exchanged a few words with Ben, Judy retrieved their daughter's work and went back to the car. The couple intended to pass some leftover food from the restaurant to Ben. John walked over to the car and opened the rear passenger door behind the driver's seat. Judy saw her husband open the car door, and almost immediately, 2 loud bangs rang out. She ducked down, and when she looked up, she saw John fall, and a person dressed all in black quickly running away from the car. It was dark, and she couldn't make out who it was. This story puzzled the detectives. Typically, a robber rarely shoots the victim immediately. Usually, there's a short conversation that escalates before it comes to gunfire, but not this time. They suspected it wasn't a botched robbery. Furthermore, besides the wallet, John was wearing a Rolex watch and other valuable men's jewelry. Judy mentioned that her husband, as a businessman, often had conflicts with other people. He was very demanding of himself and his colleagues. About 3 weeks before the murder, he had a heated argument with a former employee right in the office parking lot. The men exchanged harsh words, and police intervention was required to separate them. Company manager Ben confirmed that such an argument took place. John accused the former employee of not returning all the equipment after his departure. The employee, in turn, believed that he hadn't received all the owed payment. However, everything was resolved. The employee returned the equipment and received the appropriate payment. This turned out to be a dead-end lead that didn't lead anywhere. John was killed on a Thursday evening. However, the previous Monday, a school officer from Crown Point contacted the Merrillville police. He learned about the murder from the news and wanted to share important information. For about 6 months, he had known about a conspiracy to murder John Parker involving 3 teenagers. 2 of them were caught with a large sum of cash. The school became suspicious of how 15-year-old students had such a large sum of money, so they questioned them. Although they were interviewed separately, their stories completely matched. They told of their classmate Danny, John Parker's stepson, paying them to kill his stepfather. The seized money was only part of the sum. In reality, they received several $1,000s. However, they deceived Danny, having no intention of even coming close to his stepfather. Since the boys had no intention of committing murder, the school simply confiscated the money and did not pursue the matter further. They didn't even contact Danny's parents or interview him about the incident. Yet, this was an opportunity to learn more about the issues clearly evident in the family. Now, 6 months later, John was dead, murdered, and the police had to determine whether his stepson could be involved. Investigators began interviewing family members, friends, and neighbors of John. The overall impression was that he was an excellent boss and friend, well-liked despite being quite strict and having a volatile temper. John worked very hard but spent every evening with his family. However, it became increasingly difficult for him to keep track of his teenage children, 17-year-old Christina and 15-year-old Danny. Little Christina was simply a wonderful child, but when her mother married John and she was plunged into a world of newfound financial possibilities, all the girl wanted to do was party, enjoy life, and throw parties in their new big house. Soon, she started getting into trouble. Her younger brother Danny wasn't far behind. He was generally more spirited and restless than his sister, and his antics were accordingly mischievous. One evening, without permission and without a driver's license, he took his father's SUV and knocked over mailboxes of neighbors. After that, John had to go around to all of them and negotiate so they wouldn't report his stepson's actions to the police. It's worth noting that John himself grew up in a family with very strict rules and tried to impose similar rules on his family so that the older children wouldn't get into trouble with the law. Of course, the teenagers didn't like this and rebelled. And what about Judy? She preferred to be a friend rather than a mother to Christina and Danny. The parents seemed to be clearly divided into good and bad cops. What was most horrifying was that the younger girls saw the atmosphere in the house unfold and also didn't listen. After learning about the family situation, investigators hurried even more to find the 2 classmates of Danny and interview him himself. Danny did not deny conflicts with his stepfather, who tried to raise him as best he could. He admitted to giving money to his classmates, but not to kill John, just to scare and beat him up. And he had the money simply because he had been saving it for some time. Danny was still detained, and detectives had to find out if 2 teenagers accidentally killed John while trying to scare him. It turned out that one of the boys was in prison on the day of the murder, and the other lived in Las Vegas with his grandmother. Detectives went to Vegas and spoke with the teenager. He insisted that Danny had tried to persuade someone to actually kill his stepfather. But he and his friend tricked Danny and took the money without intending to commit murder. Police confirmed that the boy was in Vegas on April 17th, so this turned out to be another dead end. Danny was released home. Meanwhile, John's farewell took place. The man himself liked to repeat that people would forget your name, forget what you said, but they would not forget the feelings you evoked in them. At his funeral, everyone remembered what a wonderful person he was and how positively he influenced those around him. But someone directly stated that the worst part wasn't that John lay in a coffin, but that the person responsible for his death was probably in the same building with them. It was an unpleasant, oppressive feeling shared by everyone. But a week later, the image of the perfect family took another hit when a colleague of John's revealed a new lead, this time involving his stepdaughter, 17-year-old Christina. An employee of J&J Parker Industries disclosed that Christina, who also worked in her parents' company, approached him to find a hitman to kill her stepfather. For her troubles, she gave him $100 and handed over an additional $500 as a down payment for the hitman. Incredibly, this was another plot to kill John, which ended with Christina being deceived once again. However, suspicion now fell not only on Danny, but also on Christina. The girl denied everything, claiming she simply complained to her colleague about her stepfather, and he misunderstood her. Without details from Christina regarding the money exchange, investigators again hit a dead end. Was this a coincidence? Or had the teenagers conspired and were hiding a much darker plan? Several weeks later, a month after John Parker's murder, the police stumbled upon another lead leading to Christina's classmates. Under pressure, they confessed to selling a weapon to Christina that was used for shooting practice on a family farm. Officers found a tree with bullet marks on the farm, and on the ground, they discovered casings. Ballistics analysis confirmed that the casings matched those found at the crime scene. Now the police could link Christina to the purchase of the weapon, but the girl simply denied everything. And since the police didn't have the murder weapon in hand, and Christina had an alibi, she was watching a movie at home with her younger sisters, they couldn't prove that she killed John. So who pulled the trigger? The circle narrowed around family members, but for the prosecutor it wasn't enough. There was only a conspiracy, but no weapon, and no person to pin it on. Meanwhile, without John, his family and business gradually fell apart. Judy spent all her time with her new boyfriend Ben, John's right-hand man. The children were forced to take care of themselves, cooking and cleaning the house. This spoke volumes because after a tragedy, a parent instinctively seeks to spend more time with their children. Judy did just the opposite, indicating she wasn't truly attached to her husband or children. The business also declined, and Judy and the children struggled financially. Judy was supposed to receive $1 million from 2 of John's insurance policies, but because the investigation was ongoing, the insurance company refused to pay her. Judy and Ben moved with the younger girls to Michigan. Danny and his biological father went to Arizona, where the boy found work on a construction site. Christina, expecting her first child, stayed in Indiana with her boyfriend Eric. Only John's close friends and family continued to push for the investigation to continue, which it did without ceasing. In 2007, 4 years after John's murder, a detective from the narcotics department contacted one of the investigators on the case. He informed them that Christina's husband, Eric Grabsky, was involved in a drug-related investigation, and there was already a warrant out for his arrest. Detectives seized the opportunity to glean new information about the old case. They speculated that the hope of a deal with the prosecution would loosen Eric's tongue, and they were not wrong. Eric knew who killed John. The triggerman turned out to be Christina's younger brother, Danny. The question was whether Christina would confirm her husband's words. Eric called her and she agreed to come to the station. She stated that her stepbrother Danny had killed her stepfather. However, initially she tried to downplay her role, minimizing her involvement in the case. But investigators had already determined that she purchased the weapon, and it was she who called her parents about her sister's homework, even though school holidays, including Easter, were starting the next day, so there was no rush to collect Tiffany's homework. Therefore, detectives knew that Christina played an active role in the murder. They pressured her, and she confessed that she knew about all the conspiracies to kill John. She, her brother, and her mother had spent over a year trying to find someone willing to kill John, spending several $1,000s on their search. But after multiple unsuccessful attempts with incompetent contractors, they decided that Danny would do it. Detectives flew to Arizona, where Danny lived and worked. When an investigator approached him and mentioned being from Merrillville, Danny visibly softened. The detective asked, "Do you know why I'm here?" To which Danny replied, "I'm ready to tell everything." It was clear that this weighed heavily on him, and he regretted what had happened. Here's what he revealed. The murder of John was Judy's plan. She constantly told the children that she couldn't live with John anymore, that he mistreated her and was abusive. However, when Danny was asked if he ever witnessed such behavior towards his mother, he couldn't recall anything of the sort. Moreover, the police never responded to the family's address. Also, the mother promised the older children that life would be much better without John. They would have money and no control from a strict stepfather who demanded that the children study well and behave properly. Initially, Judy attempted to poison her husband personally, but she failed. Then she and the children began looking for someone willing to carry out this job for money. However, finding a killer and buying a weapon required money. To secretly obtain such large sums from her husband, Judy forged company checks. She stole $7,500 and John was about to find out about it. Ultimately, Judy decided they would do everything themselves. She devised a plan in which all three would have alibis. The mother decided her 15-year-old son, Danny, would commit the murder. Christina's role was to call and lure John to the office. Christina gave Danny the keys to her car, even though he didn't even have a driver's license yet. The accomplices took a huge risk, and at any moment, things could have gone awry. Nevertheless, the teenager climbed out of his bedroom window to avoid being noticed by his younger sisters, got in the car, drove to the office, and waited. He saw the parents arrive, hid behind a dumpster, and waited for an opportunity to shoot. When John approached the car and opened the door, Danny ran up and fired. The gun accidentally fired a second time when he tried to reach for the man's wallet, hence the second shell casing being far from the body. This clarified one of the mysteries that had been troubling the investigators. Danny then fled, got into the car, and quickly returned home, where Christina awaited with a bag into which he placed his clothes, the weapon, and the wallet. He took a shower, and they didn't discuss it further. Christina later handed the bag to her mother, and Judy disposed of it. Following Christina and Danny's confessions, both were arrested. Now the police had to arrest the puppeteer behind her husband's murder, Judy Parker, but the police had absolutely nothing against her. Fortunately, her children agreed to testify against their mother in exchange for reduced sentences. Then Judy decided to confess her guilt in 2009. Christina was sentenced to 5 years in prison for her role in the crime. However, after her release in 2013, she died of a drug overdose at the age of 27. Danny was sentenced to 23 years. He was released 3 years after his sister in 2016. Judy was sentenced to 33 years in prison. She was released in 2023. Judy spent her entire life as a sales agent, and she certainly found a way to sell the idea of murder to her own children. Most likely, she manipulated them for years, and only when they were distanced from her could they clearly see the whole picture. Of course, Judy could have divorced, but she would have received only half of the property and wouldn't have received the $1 million from the insurance. Additionally, John had evidence of marital infidelity. He gave his wife a ticket to a luxurious life, but she no longer wanted to see her husband nearby, yet she wanted to have it all, and anyone standing in her way between the life she had and the life she wanted had to disappear. She forced her teenage children to commit murder, robbing them of their childhood and burdening them with a heavy load. And she shattered the lives of her younger daughters, who now have no father, no older sister, and essentially no mother. When the body of a teenage girl was found murdered, the tiny town of Wausau in Wisconsin was gripped by fear. Everyone worried they might be the next victim of the ruthless intruder. But if the motive was money, why didn't he take it? The stories of the suspects only puzzled the detectives further. They wondered, was this merely a show to conceal what was really happening behind closed doors? Or was it genuine grief over the loss of a loved one? Until they found a startling clue that could put the final nail in the killer's coffin. Saturday, May 2nd, 2009, began like any other day for the emergency services in the quiet town of Wausau, Wisconsin. Although it was expected to be an uneventful day, a call came in at 1:30 p.m. A woman reported that her neighbor had asked her to call an ambulance for his brother's girlfriend. She was lying on the floor of their apartment with a throat wound and cuts all over her body. The police officers dispatched to the scene hoped the woman was mistaken, as the situation often turns out to be less severe than the caller describes. But not this time. Several people were waiting for the officers in the parking lot of the apartment complex. One of them stepped forward and led them to the apartment. It was 19-year-old Hugo Ramirez. The young man could barely form sentences due to how much he was crying and shaking. Hugo was about to show the detectives what had shocked him so much. The officers would not soon forget this scene either. Entering the apartment, they walked through an unremarkable living room and kitchen and approached a small hallway. Hugo pointed to the bedroom at the very end on the left. Even before stepping into the room, the officers were stunned by the sight that met their eyes. The drying blood was everywhere, on the carpet, on the belongings, and of course, on the girl lying in the center of this bloody scene. Hugo informed them that the girl's name was Brianna Schneller. Brianna lay on her back, her mutilated face covered with a towel. There were deep wounds on her neck and across the upper part of her torso. Cuts on her arms indicated that she had fought for her life, but the killer had overpowered her. Now the police needed to hurry. Journalists were already surrounding the crime scene, and it was crucial that Brianna's loved ones did not learn of her death from the news. By the time the officers contacted the Schneller family, they already knew something had happened at the apartment where the girl lived and that someone had died. But they didn't know that Brianna was the victim. Her parents had been trying to reach her without success. They were informed of the news at the station. Afterward, they were asked to identify Brianna from photographs taken at the crime scene. Even after confirming it was her parents, Craig and Lori, and her brother Rocky, still couldn't believe what had happened. Despite their unspeakable sorrow, the family members tried to provide the police with as much information as possible about Brianna and the details of her life leading up to the murder. Craig and Lori explained that Brianna's life was much like that of her peers. She was finishing school, working part-time as a waitress in a restaurant, and enjoyed spending her free time with friends. She loved shopping, dancing, and music. Moreover, Brianna was looking forward to a trip to Tennessee that summer, where she was to present an important project for a renowned non-profit national organization of professional and technical student leaders. Brianna was the only person in the entire state of Wisconsin who met all the criteria to participate in this event. To the family, what had happened made no sense. As Craig explained, she didn't have a single enemy. Her relationship with her boyfriend, 22-year-old Sebastian Ramirez, Hugo's brother, was wonderful. The couple had met a couple of years ago and had been inseparable since. During this time, the parents had gotten to know the young man well. Naturally, they had concerns when Brianna decided to move in with him at 18. They worried that she was growing up too fast. But Sebastian truly loved their daughter, so they accepted her decision. After high school, she planned to pursue higher education in restaurant management and dreamed of opening a restaurant with Sebastian. She genuinely enjoyed working in the restaurant business, and she was loved by her colleagues and customers. The girl's parents also helped the police narrow down the time frame of the attack on Brianna. Her mother, Lori, was the last person to speak with Brianna a few hours before the body was discovered. That day, Lori had taken her daughter's car to the auto shop to fix the brakes and had texted her daughter at 10 a.m. Thus, the attack occurred sometime after Lori spoke with her daughter at 10 a.m. and before Hugo found her at 1:30 p.m. While the detectives were speaking with the girl's parents, forensic experts found several clues at the crime scene. First of all, an iron lying on the floor near Brianna caught their attention. Various parts of it were scattered on the floor, and there was blood on the iron, suggesting the killer might have used it as a weapon. In the bathroom sink were 2 knives, one of which was missing its sharp tip. Blood was found on a bar of soap nearby, indicating that the killer had taken the time to wash the knives and their hands, but had missed leaving a bloody shoe print on the mat. Further examination of the apartment revealed 2 more interesting points. First, there were no signs of forced entry, and second, nothing seemed to be missing. This was especially curious because cash was scattered throughout the apartment. Various bills ranging from $1 to $20 added up to a considerable sum. If a robber had broken in for money, they would have taken it. Thus, the evidence at the crime scene indicated that Brianna herself was the target of the attack. The autopsy confirmed this conclusion. The most crucial information the medical examiner shared with the detectives was that the girl had fought for her life, and the killer's DNA likely remained under her nails. Skin samples found under her nails were sent for analysis. Overall, the autopsy confirmed what the investigators already suspected. The attack was unprecedented in its brutality and the attacker's fury. Brianna had been struck on the head with a blunt object, likely the iron found near her body. The attacker also slashed her throat with a knife and inflicted so many stab wounds that the pathologist couldn't accurately count them. The knife wounds were particularly severe, and at least 2 of them were fatal enough to kill her within a minute. The tip of one of the knives found in the sink was discovered in one of her wounds. Usually, such a savage attack indicates that the killer must have felt uncontrollable rage towards the victim to inflict so many injuries. But who could have harbored such strong feelings toward Brianna? The police knew of at least one person they needed to speak with immediately. Sebastian was brought to the station along with his brother, but they were placed in separate interrogation rooms so their statements could be compared later. Sebastian explained that he woke up around 9:15 a.m., an hour before he was due at the Mexican restaurant where he and his brother worked. The restaurant, El Tequila Salsa, was about 3 kilometers from the apartment, a 10-minute drive. The young man took a shower and chatted with Brianna, as she didn't need to go to school on Saturdays. Hugo had overslept, so his brother had to wake him up just before leaving the house at 10 a.m. By 10:15 a.m., Sebastian was already at work and was there when he received the call informing him about what had happened to his girlfriend. Hugo's story began much like his brother's version. After being woken up by his brother, he quickly got ready and left the house 15 minutes after Sebastian. Nothing unusual happened at work. At 1:20 p.m., Hugo went on a break and drove home to take a short nap. Entering the apartment, he initially didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. He walked down the hallway and into his room, but he soon felt uncomfortable as if something was wrong. That's when he noticed that Sebastian's room door was open. Hugo peeked inside and to his horror saw Brianna lying on the floor. Rushing over, Hugo started shouting her name, begging her to get up, to wake up, but she didn't respond. Only then did he notice how much blood there was in the room. He tried to dial 911, but his mind suddenly stopped working and his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't even press the buttons. He then ran downstairs, where through his panic he tried to explain to a neighbor that they needed to call for help. The young men seemed genuinely devastated by what had happened. Investigators wanted to believe them, but they knew they needed evidence to confirm their innocence. It was possible they were simply excellent actors, or were hiding remorse beneath a mask of grief and pain. Since both brothers' stories were identical, detectives considered the possibility that one of them committed the crime and the other was covering for him. In such a scenario, Sebastian seemed to have a potential motive to kill Brianna. Officers questioned the brothers about their relationship with Brianna, whether there were any issues, quarrels, or jealousy. Sebastian categorically denied any problems and stuck to his story. Brianna was the love of his life, and they were looking forward to a happy future together. Hugo was questioned with even greater scrutiny, especially after it was revealed he was supposed to work until 3 p.m. that day, but had changed his break time with a colleague due to a hangover, wanting to go home and rest. Detectives wanted to know if anything had happened between him and Brianna. Were there arguments? Perhaps Hugo also had romantic feelings for her, but Sebastian proved to be a more successful rival. However, Hugo vehemently denied this. Brianna was like a sister to him. He knew how deeply she and Sebastian loved each other, and he would never stand in their way. These interrogations continued for hours, but no matter what the police asked, Hugo and Sebastian stood by their stories. However, the brothers were able to clarify the issue of the scattered money found throughout the apartment. It was Hugo's tips. Previously, he used to carefully count all the money, but lately he had become lazy. When he came home, he simply emptied his pockets wherever, always promising himself to deal with it later. After obtaining DNA samples from the brothers, they were released, but in the eyes of the detectives, they remained the only suspects in Brianna's murder. Therefore, their next task was to either confirm or disprove the brothers' testimonies. Colleagues from the Mexican restaurant El Tequila Salsa confirmed that the young men were at work. Moreover, the restaurant had surveillance cameras, including ones that recorded the kitchen area. After reviewing the footage, the police confirmed that Sebastian arrived at work first at 10:13 a.m. and did not leave until after Brianna's body was discovered. Hugo arrived at work a few minutes later and took his break at 1:20 p.m., just as he had stated. At the same time, the detectives were following another lead. Their conclusion that nothing had been stolen from the apartment had been hasty. Although the money and valuables were indeed left behind, the police had not found Brianna's phone. Like any teenage girl, Brianna always kept her phone with her. Moreover, she had exchanged messages with her mother at 10 a.m., so she definitely had it with her before the murder. This greatly interested the police, as the phone could contain something crucial to solving her murder. Therefore, the detectives made finding the phone their priority. They contacted Brianna's service provider. The phone company pinged the device and not only found that it was on, but also pinpointed its exact location. The detectives took one look at the address and were stunned. They knew this place. More than that, they had just been there. The phone was located near the El Tequila Salsa restaurant where the brothers Sebastian and Hugo worked. The detectives rushed to the location to find and seize the device as quickly as possible. Upon arrival, they realized that the coordinates were not for the restaurant itself, but for the parking lot of the shopping center where the restaurant was located. The police soon narrowed down the search area to the section where the dumpsters were. The detectives were reluctant to sift through all the garbage bags and had a simple yet brilliant idea. They called the phone, opening the dumpsters one by one. Finally, they heard the ringtone. Carefully moving the contents of the dumpster, the officers saw a light-colored bag through which the phone's screen light was visible. The bag contained several items, not just the phone. The police were eager to open it but had to send it to the lab first because it could have DNA on it, especially on the top where someone had carefully twisted it closed. However, the detectives could already make one conclusion. This was not an ordinary bag, but a bag with the logo of the El Tequila Salsa restaurant, which customers used for takeout orders. The circle around the brothers was tightening more and more. Of course, they seemed to have an alibi, but the investigators couldn't believe that anyone else had committed the murder. Moreover, the pathologist couldn't determine the exact time of the girl's death to the minute. What if the crime happened a little earlier than they assumed? The girl had communicated with her mother at 10 a.m. Immediately after that, one of the brothers, or even both, killed Brianna, quickly got ready, and showed up at work at 10:15 a.m. Then they threw the bag with the evidence into the trash bin near the restaurant, hoping no one would find it. After the forensic experts collected DNA samples from the bag, it could finally be opened. Inside, in addition to Brianna's phone, there were warm gloves, but from different pairs, with one of them stained with blood, and also women's underwear, 2 pairs of panties. The investigators had expected anything, but not this. They had more questions than answers. According to Sebastian, the underwear belonged to Brianna. One of the gloves likely had been taken from the apartment as well. However, these items contradicted all the theories the detectives had been considering. If Hugo or Sebastian had committed the crime, it would be absurd for them to take the girl's underwear. But Sebastian and Hugo did not kill the girl. After examining Brianna's phone, investigators saw that her last conversation was not with her mother, but with a friend. Brianna sent her last message at 10:23, when the brothers had already definitely arrived at the restaurant, as confirmed by surveillance cameras. The entire investigation turned upside down. The police had never considered any other suspects besides the Ramirez brothers, but it turned out that both were completely innocent. So, who was the killer? And why did they dispose of the bag with evidence right near the El Tequila Salsa restaurant? Now, the detectives had to add a multitude of names to their list of suspects, employees and patrons of the El Tequila Salsa restaurant. They considered it highly unlikely that someone unrelated to the restaurant killed Brianna, collected incriminating evidence, and disposed of it right near the restaurant. Therefore, they first reviewed the list of employees, and one name caught their attention: Luciano Sanchez Ramos. The young man worked as a dishwasher at the restaurant and lived in the same building as Brianna. But most importantly, he was home on the morning of the murder. He arrived at work half an hour after Brianna sent her last message to her friend. When the police brought him in for questioning, he did not show much willingness to talk. Perhaps this was due to his immigration status or just a general distrust of the police. Nevertheless, he agreed to provide a DNA sample. The detective asked if anyone could verify his alibi, even partially. Luciano said there was someone, his colleague, the restaurant's cook Raul, who gave him a ride to work. The police spoke with Raul, who confirmed that he picked up Luciano. Raul honked his horn, and within a couple of minutes, Luciano came out of the house behaving as usual. The investigators wanted some reliable confirmation of this and hoped that surveillance cameras might reveal what Luciano did that morning. Did he really just go to work at 11 a.m., or did he stop by the dumpster to dispose of the evidence? Unfortunately, all the restaurant's cameras filmed only inside the establishment. However, There was a gas station across from the dumpsters that had its own surveillance cameras. The quality of the footage left much to be desired, and the dumpsters were far from the gas station. Still, these videos provided invaluable help to the investigation. On May 9th, the police finally finished reviewing all the footage from the restaurant and the parking lot where the dumpsters were located. Individually, these videos were not very useful, but when the detectives correlated the timestamps, they obtained a much clearer picture of what had happened. At 1:16 p.m., one person exited through the restaurant's back door. Simultaneously, only one person approached the dumpster. It was 22-year-old restaurant cook Raul Ponce Rocha. He threw away the trash, quickly returned to the restaurant kitchen, and washed his hands. What was even more interesting was that Raul was the only one who left the restaurant during the time frame when Brianna's murder was committed. At 10:21 a.m., just a few minutes after the Ramirez brothers arrived at work, he exited through the back door to go pick up Luciano and returned at 10:56 a.m. Notably, he left wearing a brown hoodie but returned without it. He confirmed that he and Luciano did not make any stops on their way back to work. The detectives asked him why he was gone for 35 minutes when the trip to pick up Luciano should have taken a maximum of 20 minutes. Where did the extra 15 minutes go? Raul was surprisingly stubborn and did not attempt to explain. The detective then asked about the cuts on his hands. Raul explained that as a cook, he frequently handled knives and had cut himself about 3 weeks ago, although the cuts looked fresh. While the investigators were confident that they had the right suspect, one question continued to trouble them. Why did Raul attack Brianna, and with such brutality? After all, he barely knew her. The Ramirez brothers had always treated him well, considering him a jovial fellow who often told funny stories and never had any quarrels with them. But detectives soon found the answer to this question. The police had enough evidence to obtain a DNA sample from Raul and a search warrant for the house where he lived with his parents and brothers. To prevent him from fleeing, they detained him based on his illegal immigration status. During the search of his bedroom, police found a glove that matched the one found in the dumpster, a sweatshirt with strands of hair that could belong to Brianna, and, finally, under the mattress, several adult videos and 4 pairs of women's panties. Everything fell into place when officers remembered Brianna's mother Lori's words about how she had taken her daughter's car to the auto repair shop that day. On the morning of May 2, 2009, Raul arrived at the restaurant around 9 a.m. On his way, he passed by the house where the girl lived and noticed that her car was not in its usual spot. He made a fatal mistake, assuming she wasn't home. Knowing that Hugo and Sebastian would soon arrive for work, he decided it was a perfect opportunity to add to his modest collection and steal something from Brianna's belongings. Just minutes after the Ramirez brothers arrived for work, Raul left, got into his car, and under the pretext of picking up Luciano, headed to the girl's house. He didn't immediately signal Luciano and instead went into the apartment where the brothers and Brianna lived. The lock on the apartment door was not very secure and could easily be opened with a plastic card. He entered the apartment. If the girl had caught him in the act, Raul could have claimed he was looking for the brothers and that the door was open. But most likely, the girl caught him stealing her underwear. Realizing she could identify him, Raul panicked, first hitting her with an iron and then slashing her throat with a knife, inflicting several other wounds. Detectives speculate that he began to derive pleasure from the process. Otherwise, it's unclear why he would strike her multiple times with 2 knives. After the murder, he quickly tried to clean up and took the evidence with him, as he still needed to pick up Luciano. He then returned to work as if nothing had happened and disposed of the evidence packet. All doubts about Raul's involvement disappeared when the lab results arrived. His DNA was found on the knife, the packet, the gloves, the iron, and under Brianna's fingernails. The hair on his sweatshirt also belonged to the victim. Furthermore, a blood-stained shoe print in the bathroom matched the size and pattern of Raul's shoes that he wore on the day of the murder. Raul was charged with Brianna's murder. The trial began in 2011. Initially, during interrogations, Raul claimed he had never spoken to Brianna and never entered the house where she lived. However, by the start of the trial, his story changed. Despite almost pinning the murder on Sebastian and Hugo, Raul showed no remorse and decided to accuse an innocent third person of the crime. He claimed that he had entered the apartment but left, leaving behind his colleague Sergio Juarez Gutierrez, who Brianna was discussing something with in another room. This statement could have planted doubts in the minds of the jurors because Sergio hastily left for Mexico, and Raul's lawyers were confident they wouldn't be able to question him. However, the police managed to contact Sergio in Mexico, and he was not pleased to hear that his name had been dragged through the mud. He returned for the trial and proved that he was nowhere near Brianna on the day of the murder. Sergio had returned to Mexico shortly before the murder to take care of his father, who had cancer. No one expected Sergio to appear in court, and it was a serious blow to the defendant's defense. It took the jurors only 90 minutes to find Raul guilty of first-degree murder, robbery, and theft. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Thus, a young woman lost her life due to a tragic mistake. Raul did not enter the apartment with the intention of killing her. But why did he choose murder instead of being charged with unlawful entry? Was he afraid of being deported? That everyone would find out about his collection? Or did he simply not realize the consequences of his actions? Did he cover Brianna's face with a towel, unable to face what he had done? Brianna's father admitted that he wanted to talk to Raul, perhaps to ask him all these questions. However, Raul declined his offer to meet. He never took responsibility for the crime. His decision was based solely on the assumption that Brianna wasn't home. After the trial, Lori Schneller said that the verdict wouldn't bring back her daughter, but would allow them to live on. "We are glad that justice was served for her," she said. "I don't know if there will ever be a day like before, but it has become a little easier after the verdict." On the evening of Friday, April 20th, 2012, the Solis family had a very pleasant time. Rebecca and Sergio's two sons played a baseball game in which their 6-year-old sister, young Isabel, was present. The game lasted until 10 o'clock, after which the family returned home. The next morning, the girl was supposed to play baseball and Rebecca braided her hair so as not to waste time before work. At 11 o'clock, Sergio wished his daughter good night and left. Although Isabel had her own bedroom, she often slept in her brother's room. But on this particular night, she stayed alone. Soon, Becky and the boys went to sleep, and Sergio fell asleep on the couch, watching a baseball game he had recorded earlier. At 5 o'clock, the man woke up and slowly made his way to the bedroom. The house was quiet and peaceful when he went to sleep next to his wife. 2 hours later, Rebecca left for work at the medical center. The woman didn't notice anything strange in the house and didn't hear anything. She didn't go into her daughter's room before leaving for work. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, Sergio went to wake his daughter up to go to the game, but Isabel was not in her bed. He asked his sons if they had seen their sister, but nobody responded. Together with the boys, he searched the house and called for Isabel, but there was no answer. Then, Sergio Jr., who was 14 years old at the time, noticed that the window in his sister's room was wide open and the protective screen was lying on the ground in the yard. The husband called his wife. While Rebecca was racing home and the sons were frantically searching the neighborhood for their younger sister, Sergio called the rescue service. This was the call that later sparked a lot of controversy and criticism towards him. People react differently in a state of stress or panic, but Sergio was surprisingly calm and collected during the call. Besides his calmness, it seemed strange to many that he immediately stated that his daughter had been kidnapped. He even laughed when he mentioned telling his wife to come home. Later, Sergio explained that he was simply trying to remain calm to provide the police with all the information they needed. Interestingly, the neighbor also called 911 on behalf of Sergio Jr. Unlike his father, he was shaking and clearly upset, but he also immediately stated that his sister had been kidnapped and they wouldn't find her. Then the phone was handed over to Rebecca, who had also been in a panic and despair when she arrived home. She was able to give a precise description of the clothing that her daughter was wearing before her disappearance. The arriving officers indeed found a protective screen on the bedroom window of the girl on the ground in the yard. There was a large hole in it, as if someone had used a tool to make it. Soft toys were always lying under the girl's window in the room, and now they were scattered in disorder. Blood was discovered on the floor next to Isabel. Shoe prints were found behind the house, on the alley and on the electrical box under the high fence of the family. Presumably, The perpetrator climbed over it when he abducted the girl. The police organized massive searches, going from door to door, believing it was a kidnapping case, rejecting the idea that the 6-year-old girl could have run away. The neighbor of the Sellis family, Alicia Stardevant, said that she was woken up by a noise around 6:30 a.m. Her bedroom is literally across the fence from the girl's room. The girl said that she heard her dogs and the Sellis family dogs barking. Besides them, she heard men's voices, seemingly on her side of the fence, not at the Sellis family's home. But it was already getting light outside, and she didn't pay attention to it and fell asleep again. Alicia noted that the men did not lower their voices or whisper, and she didn't think for a second that there was also a small child there. The police set up a checkpoint around the Sellis family's house and only allowed local residents through. The search initially focused on a small area around the house because in most cases, children are killed within a radius of 100 meters from the place of abduction. Then they expanded the search radius, included several apartment buildings, and interviewed residents. Officers checked the stadium where Isabel's baseball game was supposed to take place, the local garbage dump. The lakes and ponds were inspected with underwater cameras and sonars. Forensic experts and search dogs searched the Sellis family's home, and border guards distributed photos of Isabel because when children go missing in Arizona, there is a high chance they end up on the other side of the border with Mexico. In addition, in 2012, 16 criminals who had committed violent acts against women and children lived near the family's home. All of them were interrogated and excluded at that time. A theory emerged that someone had noticed Isabel playing with her brothers in the evening, followed the family, and abducted the girl from the house at night. Following this lead, officers checked the registration numbers of all the cars in the parking lot. Surveillance video cameras located near the family's home showed an unusually active nightlife. At 2:36 a.m., a private security company's car appeared in the alley near the house, and 2 more cars were shown in the parking lot 10 minutes later. Suddenly, a large number of pedestrians were wandering around the house, some of them interested in garbage cans, and an hour before the 911 call, a car quickly turned the corner near the trash can. But the girl did not appear anywhere in the 10 hours of filming. However, something interesting was discovered during the search of the house by the police. The officers found inscriptions on the door frame of Isabel's wardrobe. The inscriptions were written in a child's handwriting and included such words as bad father, I don't love father, and bad day. Rebecca claimed she had no idea about this, but the police decided to interrogate Isabel's family more thoroughly. One of the sons revealed that when their father drank, he became aggressive, cursed, and hit him twice. Therefore, investigators invited employees of the Child Protection Services concerned about the Sellis sons, especially since, as it turned out, Child Protection Services had been called to the family's home more than once. In January 2012, one of the boys was washing dishes and left a glass in the detergent. Sergio drank water from that glass and scolded his son for his mistake. Rebecca insists that they laughed about the incident. But the next day, the boy told his friends about it, and someone's parents contacted the Child Protection Services. Anyway, in May 2012, at their request, Sergio voluntarily left the house, although Rebecca claimed that her husband was an excellent father and when Isabel returned home, all questions would be answered. Although the incident was soon resolved, and Sergio was able to return home to his wife and sons, the family was upset that the investigation did not bring any results. Although the incident was soon resolved and Sergio was able to return home to his wife and children, the family was upset that the police continued to focus on them, especially Sergio, despite never being named a suspect. Later, the man stated, "It feels like the investigation never went beyond this house. That's what's so upsetting." So they hired private detective Jerry Snyder to conduct an unbiased investigation into Isabel's abduction. And his suspicions fell on Rebecca's cousin, Justin Mastromarino. At first, Justin acted as a representative of the family, constantly speaking to journalists and giving interviews. But within 2 weeks of Isabel's disappearance, he sent his car to Florida, hired the best lawyer, and left, refusing to answer reporters or police's questions. Such behavior seemed strange to the private detective. Moreover, Justin had lived in the Solis family's home for a long time and still had a key to the house. There was a version that Justin, who had previously stayed overnight in Isabel's room, could owe money to someone and the criminal came for him. But instead of Justin, he found Isabel in the room and took her for ransom or as leverage. On the other hand, his friend Sebastian Hartsfield is confident that Mastro Marino did the right thing, and if he had the means, he would have left too. The thing is, Justin was tired of the intrusive attention of the media and the public. Sebastian said that they spent the evening of the abduction together with Justin. He reluctantly admits that it was April 20th, National Cannabis Day, so he and Justin smoked and drank all evening, although there was a 6-hour gap when they were asleep, and he cannot say for sure where Justin was. Sebastian is confident in his friend's innocence. When the police finally questioned Justin, the police chief said that the investigator hired by the family had no evidence, but the police were absolutely sure of Justin's innocence. It is worth noting that Sergio was also suspected of owing money to bad people, and his daughter was kidnapped for ransom. Isabel was at the age when children are more often abducted by relatives. She was kidnapped from the house where only her relatives were present, and Sergio was the last person to see her, kissing her goodnight at 11 o'clock. He did not pass a polygraph test. Moreover, the fact that the dogs barked at night indirectly confirms the involvement of someone from the family. How could a stranger know where the girl's room was, that she wouldn't be sleeping in her brother's bedroom, and that there would be no dogs in her room? Usually, at least one of them slept in her bedroom. How could the kidnapper know exactly how to avoid the surveillance cameras located on the street? Yet, besides suspicion, there was nothing linking Sergio or Justin to the crime. Where was Isabel? Let's go back to the morning of July 23, 2012, when the rescue service received 3 distress calls. A child, a girl, called and said she wanted to report a kidnapping. She mentioned Isabel's name and said he's coming, identified the district where she was located, and then the call disconnected. The officers went to the specified district, but they didn't find anyone. They traced the call to an apartment building where 2 sisters, aged 9 and 11, lived. The sisters had simply decided to play a prank. The calls caused a lot of fuss, but they were quickly released. However, their joke cost the city $4,700 in officers' wages spent on the search in the district specified by the girls. After this incident, the police tried several times to draw attention to the case, for example, by sharing an image of what Isabel might look like several years later. But despite all efforts, there was no progress in the case for years. Who kidnapped Isabel? Was it someone unknown to the family who entered through a window and took her? Did Justin consider kidnapping Isabel because he was in debt and wanted to demand a ransom, but the kidnapping went wrong? Was one of her brothers involved in what happened to her, and are their relatives covering it up? Or does Isabel's biological father know more than he's saying? Unexpectedly, on February 8, 2017, there was a breakthrough in the case. A woman named Melissa contacted the FBI and stated that they should speak to her fiancé, Christopher Clements, about the disappearance of Isabel. Supposedly, he might know something about the girl's disappearance, but Melissa couldn't say anything more and they should talk to him. Finding Christopher proved to be quite easy. He was in jail on charges of robbery. Christopher confirmed to the agents that he knew where to find Isabel, but demanded a deal. In exchange for information about Isabel's whereabouts, he wants his charges dropped, his confiscated Acura Honda returned, and full immunity in Isabel's case. He assured them that he only knows what happened to the girl. It is also known to a member of the Celis family. He hinted that Sergio knew about the kidnapping of his daughter and was involved in it. Christopher told them that Sergio was seen handing over Mexican gold coins to someone at a local pawn shop. Supposedly, there was a fight and Isabel was taken to get the money that her father owed for the stolen coins. Christopher spoke very broadly, and no matter how much the agents questioned him, he didn't go into details. The man stood his ground, information in exchange for a deal. He got what he wanted. The prosecutor's office went for a deal, dropped the charges of robbery and returned the car. The man revealed where to find Isabel, and on March 3, 2017, the police and the FBI found her remains. Rebecca and Sergio Solis faced the grim confirmation that Isabel had left forever. Whatever dreams they had of a happy reunion were destroyed. However, the deal did not give Christopher Clements the desired freedom. Instead, he was transferred to the Maricopa County Jail, where he was charged with another robbery. The agreement did not provide full immunity, which Christopher insisted on in Isabel's case. Investigators began digging deeper into the man's past. He started his criminal career at the age of 16 by committing first-degree violence. Since then, he had repeatedly gotten into trouble. The man's ex-wife said that Christopher was obsessed with adult movies, often brought girls from strip clubs home, and she was forced to sleep in the car until they left. And at the time of Isabel's disappearance, he worked at a shopping center only 2 kilometers away from her home. Undoubtedly, detectives checked Sergio's connection to the nearby pawn shop mentioned by Christopher. They found out that 21 gold coins were stolen from the woman's house 2 months before Isabel's abduction, and they believed that Christopher committed the theft. The surveillance camera captured him entering the pawn shop hours after the theft, delivering the goods, and receiving the money. The video did not suggest Sergio's involvement or any connection to the case. Most likely, Christopher was just studying the accusations against Sergio, which were mentioned in the press, and was talking to agents, trying to cast a shadow on the girl's father. The police received several search warrants, including one for the house where Christopher and his fiancée Melissa used to live. In one corner of the yard, investigators found a sheet of plywood under which was a plastic container containing ashes and several gruesome discoveries, including a faded lilac child's hoodie with a hood and a school assignment of a very young child with the name Mercedes on it. Her full name was Isabel Mercedes Celis. They also found indecent photos of girls aged 3 to 13 on Christopher's devices. Searches on his computer included Isabel Celis, unsolved cases in Arizona, and child killer acquitted. A former acquaintance of Christopher's said he talked about the Isabel case and let slip that there might be evidence in the trunk of his car, so it was crucial to bring it back. The car was described as a Honda Acura that was returned to the man in exchange for information about Isabel's whereabouts. It is still unknown how Isabel died, but according to the same acquaintance, she was suffocated and her body was doused with chemicals. The man remembered that Christopher showed him photos of the Celis house that he had hidden in a Bible in his room. Investigators obtained a warrant for this Bible and indeed found pictures of the house. 2 months later, the Tucson police chief announced that they had a suspect, 36-year-old Christopher Clements, who had been charged with not 1, but 2 murders. The thing is, on March 3, 2017, when Christopher described to agents the location where they would find Isabel, he mentioned an important marker, a pile of tires that clearly did not appear there in just 1 day. This instruction immediately alarmed the agents, because a few years ago, the police found the body of a teenage girl from Tucson near that same tire pile. The girl's name was Maribel Gonzalez. In June 2014, 2 years had passed since Isabel's disappearance, when a rescue service dispatcher answered a horrifying call. A woman reported a body she had noticed by the roadside. The police who arrived on the call found signs that someone had been dragged on the ground, the smell of decay, and a naked body buried under the pile of tires. It was a location significantly distant from the nearest houses. The police shared with the media a photo of a chain with an anchor that the girl was wearing, as well as a tattoo on her collarbone, in hopes that the public would help identify her. Indeed, several people called the police saying that it was 13-year-old Maribel Gonzalez. Maribel's family said that she was seeing a 20-year-old man named Mariano. They had been together for 3 years but broke up a month before Maribel disappeared. Mariano told the police that she sent him a message around 11 to 12 p.m. on the day of her disappearance, asking him to pick her up because she had a fight with her mother. He ignored her message because he had to get up early for work. He never saw her again. Her boyfriend said that she loved to walk alone, even at night. She also liked to go to the mall, the same one near Isabel's house where Christopher Clements worked. The police linked these cases based on the fact that the bodies were found in close proximity to each other. Christopher's DNA was compared to the DNA found on Maribel, and it matched. Isabel was kidnapped and killed 2 years before Maribel. Could the perpetrator have been caught after the first crime and prevented Maribel's death? It turns out that Christopher's name came up during the investigation before his conversation with the agents in 2018, more than once. As it is already known, the officers contacted all individuals who committed sexual crimes and lived nearby Isabel, violent acts against women and children. The list contained 16 names, including Christopher. He was listed as a Class 3 offender, meaning with a very high likelihood of reoffending. The police talked to him, but obviously he was able to convince the officer that he had nothing to do with the case. Perhaps his girlfriend provided him with an alibi. Furthermore, after Isabel's disappearance, her parents asked to recall any unexpected meetings, uninvited guests, traders, advertising agents, distributors, anyone who could arouse suspicion. Rebecca immediately remembered the man who was interested in their red Acura. He came twice, but the woman did not know his name, and he never entered the house. Interestingly, Christopher also mentioned that meeting during the interrogations. This is what he told FBI agents on February 10, 2017. According to him, 2 people pretended to be interested in the car. In fact, they needed to make sure that Sergio lived at that address. They approached Rebecca, and she gave them the phone number and said that they needed to talk about the possibility of buying from her husband Sergio. Thus, the men confirmed what they wanted. Christopher said that he just knew about this visit, but he himself never approached the Solisev's house. However, during the conversation, he several times referred to we instead of they, as if confessing that one of the men was him. Christopher's description of the visit coincides with Rebecca's story, except for one detail. The woman described only one man who matched Christopher's description and drove the same car as he did. But her description differs slightly from the description given by her husband. What if the police had followed this lead immediately after Isabel's disappearance? Would it have led them to Christopher Clements? Investigators believe that the kidnapping of Isabel was not spontaneous. Christopher had planned his crimes. He repeatedly called the home of the woman from whom he stole gold coins when she was not home. He also called the Celis family home as early as October 2011. The day after the kidnapping, Christopher changed his phone number and washed his car. If cleaning his car usually cost him around $10, $35, this time he paid $110. However, changing his phone number did not help, as phone records linked Christopher to 2 crimes. Footprints found at the scene of Isabel's kidnapping matched sneakers that no one in the Celis family wore, but which Christopher was often seen wearing and even photographed in. Detectives also studied photos on his devices and found a miniature snapshot. It was a selfie of a man on the front seat of a car who looked like Clements, and a little girl lying on the back seat who was extremely similar to Isabel. The photo was shown to Sergio and Rebecca. The woman agreed that the girl resembled Isabel, but she could not say for sure because the image quality was terrible. Christopher claimed the child in the photo was his son. But when the photo was shown to Melissa, his fiancée, she began to shake. She did not recognize the child as her own. The child in the photo did not resemble the 1.5-year-old fair-haired boy. Instead, it was more like a dark-haired girl with her hair braided, which Isabel's mother had done just before the kidnapping. The defense argued that the footprints were initially described as work boots. Christopher did not have his phone with him during those calls, and the blood in Isabel's bedroom probably appeared before the kidnapping. Christopher's lawyers successfully pushed for 2 separate trials, one for the Isabel case and one for the Maribel case, so that the prosecutor could not present evidence for both crimes at once. However, this did not help him much because he had already been found guilty of Maribel Gonzalez's murder. He still has to face trial for the kidnapping of Isabel. Monday, May 2, 2005, the police station in the French town of Egmore. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, an officer answered a call that seemed strange to him, to say the least. On the line was an informant claiming that something terrible might happen to a young woman in a few hours. The informant explained that a couple was sitting at a table on the terrace of the L'Escale bar in Egmort, and the police needed to act immediately because her companion was extremely dangerous. The officer who answered the call heard a panicked voice on the other end shout, "The man who just left me is planning to abduct a girl. He's dangerous, and I think he's going to do something terrible." The caller was 63-year-old local resident Dominique Tarasco. Tarasco's voice trembled as he told the police about a conversation he had with a friend earlier that day. His friend was a cruel and dangerous man, and from their conversation, Tarasco deduced that he intended to harm a young girl. The police tried to obtain more information from Dominique, what his friend looked like, his name, who they should be looking for. However, despite his initial willingness to help, Tarasco refused to reveal his friend's name, stating that he feared for his own life. No promise of protection could compel him to disclose the name. However, he did provide the police with the location where his friend was supposed to meet. He said his friend would meet an unsuspecting girl on the terrace of the L'Escale bar. Tarasco also gave the police a description of his friend's car, a green 1994 Seat Ibiza. Time was running out rapidly. If an abduction was planned, the police didn't have time to extract more information from Tarasco. 4 officers got into 2 cars and immediately headed to the bar. They arrived at the establishment around 6:15 p.m. The police turned off their sirens and pretended to be just enjoying themselves at the bar. It was crucial not to spook the suspect. However, they quickly realized that trying to find unknown abductors and the girl was nearly impossible. It was the last evening of a 3-day weekend, and the streets, as well as the bar's terrace, were crowded with couples having a good time. None of the girls appeared frightened. Not knowing whom to look for, 2 officers started scanning for the Seat Ibiza. An hour passed, but the police couldn't find the couple or the car. Detectives began to wonder if Dominique had been mistaken. They called him to clarify the details he had provided. Suddenly, Dominique's heart sank. He realized that he had described the wrong car. In reality, his friend drove a gray 1994 Citroën ZX. The police were incredibly frustrated that they had been searching for the wrong vehicle while the Citroën might have slipped right under their noses, and they wouldn't even have noticed. After another thorough search, they confirmed that they couldn't see the needed car anywhere. The race against time to save the girl came to a forced halt. The police were at a dead end. Since Dominique refused to provide more information, there was nothing they could do. The officers returned to the station and checked if there were any reports of missing local girls, but there were none. Dominique had given the police incomplete and inaccurate information. A logical question arises. Why did they believe him in the first place? Dominique Tarasco was known to the local police. Officially, he was involved in collecting recyclables, but unofficially, he was the owner of an illegal nightclub near Egmort. The seemingly simple wooden shed housed a popular establishment frequented by both local celebrities and less reputable individuals. The police wanted to shut down the illegal club, but Tarasco managed to strike a deal with them. He had become a police informant, and in exchange, law enforcement turned a blind eye to his business. Tarasco had already been of great use to the police, providing them with information about impending crimes that had led to several arrests. However, none of these cases had been as serious as a human abduction. 2 days later, a 25-year-old man named Sylvain Rosin walked into the police station in Marseille, 180 kilometers from Egmort. Sylvain was extremely worried as he had been unable to contact his wife, Elodie Morel, for 2 days. She had left home to meet with a well-known photographer in Egmort. Sylvain explained that 28-year-old Elodie had worked as a waitress in bars and restaurants for most of her life, but she had grown tired of long night shifts, unpredictable working hours, low pay, and difficult customers. Given her interest in the fashion industry and natural beauty, she decided to pursue her long-standing dream of becoming a model. In April 2005, she registered on a website for people aspiring to work in the fashion industry. Elodie applied for any modeling job she could find, and then she came across an incredibly enticing offer. Renowned photographer Nicole Forestier was looking for models to represent Rolls-Royce. The photo shoot was scheduled to last for 5 days, and the 3 selected models would receive €1,000 for each shooting day, with expenses for food, accommodation, and transportation covered. Furthermore, the girls who impressed would travel to the United States as representatives of Rolls-Royce. This was Elodie's dream job, and she understood that her chances were slim with fierce competition ahead. Nevertheless, she submitted her application to participate in the competition. Prepared for rejection, she was overjoyed when Nicole wrote to her, informing her that she had secured the job. The photographer explained that Elodie had precisely the look she was seeking. When Sylvain heard that Elodie had been chosen as one of the 3 models for the photo shoot, her enthusiasm became infectious, although he did wonder if this could be a trap set by people preying on young, attractive girls. The police asked Sylvain why he allowed his wife to meet with the photographer in the first place, and he replied that he trusted his wife, who was an intelligent woman and would not fall for a foolish trick. Moreover, he felt that a meeting with a woman in a public place in the middle of the day couldn't hold any danger. The last message Sylvain received from his wife came on May 2nd at 9:30 p.m., a few hours after her meeting with the photographer. It read, "Kisses, everything is going fine. I'll call you tomorrow when I can. Kisses and hugs. We'll talk later." While the police spoke with Sylvain, they sensed that he might be hiding something. He tried to evade their questions, but eventually confessed that he and his wife had been arguing frequently recently and had even decided to separate, although they continued living together for the sake of their son. The police believed that the couple's relationship and Elodie's last message suggested that she might have chosen not to contact her husband voluntarily. However, Sylvain insisted that there was no reason for his wife to conceal a new romance, if there was one, and that she would never, ever abandon their son. She had always wanted their son to grow up in a loving family, something she herself had lacked in her childhood. The police had no doubts that there could be a million innocent reasons why the young woman hadn't been in touch with her husband. Perhaps she had no cell phone signal, or she had lost her phone. However, Sylvain insisted that something needed to be done. Finally, the Marseille police relented, compiled a report with Elodie's description and where she was last seen, and sent it to other police stations. The police in Aigues-Mortes continued to investigate missing persons reports, hoping to find any connection to the story Dominique Tarasco had shared 2 days earlier. When a fax arrived from the Marseille police detailing Elodie Morel's disappearance, the detectives couldn't help but feel uneasy. Elodie's last known location was Aigues-Mortes on May 2nd, and she had a meeting with an unknown individual at a bar around 6 p.m. The remarkable similarities between Elodie's disappearance and Dominique's potential abduction report couldn't be ignored. Detectives got in touch with Sylvain to gather more information about his wife. When Sylvain described the details of his wife's meeting with the photographer, they matched exactly what the police already knew from Dominique's account. These were the 2 pieces of the same story. Detectives asked Sylvain to come to the Aigues-Mortes police station and bring photos of his spouse. He also provided a description of his wife's car, the clothes she had taken with her, copies of Elodie's correspondence with Nicole Forestier, and his wife's phone number. Calls to the phone were immediately redirected to voicemail, indicating that the phone was either turned off or malfunctioning. However, the police managed to trace the ping from Elodie's phone and determined her location before her mobile went dead. On May 2nd, her phone was in Aigues-Mortes, confirming that she had safely arrived in the city on that day. Later, she was located in the commune of Saint-Gilles, which is 30 kilometers from Aigues-Mortes. This indicated that Elodie was likely on her way to the photo shoot location. Strangely, the signal then came from Vauvert, which is 19 kilometers in the opposite direction. Shortly after appearing in Vauvert, the ping from Elodie's phone disappeared and never reappeared. The police believed that they couldn't conduct a search in Aigues-Mortes, Saint-Gilles, and Vauvert all at once. The area was too extensive. Only one person could help them now, Dominique Tarasco. They asked him to come to the station. He arrived around 8:30 p.m. and shared a story with the detectives that sent shivers down their spines. It was hard for them to believe. On the evening of May 2nd, after Tarasco had called the police to report a possible abduction, he drove into town to have dinner and distract himself from his thoughts. A few hours later, he was returning home along a country road. In the darkness, he noticed flashing blue and red lights. 2 police cars were blocking the road and several officers were standing nearby. Tarasco assumed that the police were conducting a stakeout on the potential kidnapper. He stopped his car and got out to inquire about the progress of the search for the girl. Although he had not disclosed the name of the potential abductor to the detectives, Tarasco hoped that the police had located the man's car. Meanwhile, the officers observed an agitated man approaching them, waving his arms and shouting strange questions. When he got closer, they could tell that he was slightly intoxicated. The man was asking whether they had found the car, arrested the suspect, and if the girl was okay, but the police couldn't make sense of his words. They didn't understand what he was talking about because they were simply conducting a routine check on cars passing along that road. While Tarasco was talking to the police, a car slowly approached them. Dominique instantly recognized the vehicle. It was his friend's gray Citroën ZX from 1994. It was his friend's car. As the officers were preoccupied with Dominique, the car drove past the police vehicles and sped away without being stopped. Tarasco noticed his friend in the driver's seat, and a beautiful, long-haired girl was sitting in the passenger seat. She seemed to be leaning against the window as if asleep. Dominique became extremely uneasy. He began demanding that the police chase after the car and arrest the driver, but they were no longer listening to him. Suddenly, the man's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and saw that it was his friend, who had just driven past him. Dominique's heart sank, but he managed to answer the call. As it turned out, his friend hadn't noticed him. Instead, he called to warn Dominique about the police presence near his home, advised him to be careful, and then ended the call. When Tarasco recounted this incredible story at the police station, the investigators were shocked. They found it hard to believe. What were the chances that Tarasco had approached the roadblock and effectively distracted the police just as his friend happened to drive by? And why was he only sharing this information now? Tarasco explained that he was terrified of his friend. With a certain degree of skepticism, the investigators contacted the officers who had been conducting the vehicle check that day and managed to confirm that there had indeed been a roadside check that evening. Someone had called Dominique after the gray Citroën ZX had passed by. Everything Tarasco had said was verified. He was telling the truth. His description of the girl in the car perfectly matched Elodie Morel. There was also no doubt about the identity of the driver of the car since Tarasco's friend had called him to warn about the police. And their patience had worn thin. They demanded a name. The investigators threatened Tarasco with imprisonment and pressed him to reveal the identity. Unable to withstand the pressure any longer, Tarasco finally gave in. Tearfully, he uttered the name of the abductor, Guillaume Mingaud. Guillaume Mingaud, 49 years old, had a long history of brushes with the law. He was known for hunting young foreign women traveling by car for his vile purposes. After his release from prison, he visited an old acquaintance and asked for a job. This acquaintance turned out to be Dominique Tarasco. Dominique had no desire to employ such a dangerous person, but fearing Mingaud himself, he hired him as a bouncer in his nightclub, where his violent nature could serve some purpose. On May 2nd, Mingaud was at Tarasco's establishment, where he boasted about having a meeting with a beautiful girl on the bar's terrace. However, Guillaume's choice of words unsettled Tarasco. Knowing Mingaud's proclivities, he felt obliged to inform the police about the impending encounter between a dangerous repeat offender and an unsuspecting girl. Learning of Mingaud's criminal history, the police immediately classified him as the prime suspect. However, the case was still based on Tarasco's vague statements and could be dismissed as a series of unlikely coincidences. Detectives needed evidence of Elodie's abduction by Guillaume Mingaud. They questioned the bar staff, who confirmed that Mingaud was a regular customer and had arrived with a beautiful girl that day. It became increasingly evident that Elodie Morel was in the hands of a very dangerous individual capable of anything. Yet, the detectives had no idea where to find the suspect. Mingaud had traveled extensively, often staying with acquaintances or spending nights in nightclubs. He could be anywhere. Therefore, they set up a trap to lure him. Detectives forced Dominique to call Mingaud and arrange a meeting. Mingaud told Dominique that he would be at a nightclub in Montpellier, a 30-minute drive from Aigues-Mortes. The club was familiar to Mingaud as he had once worked there as a bouncer. Officers positioned themselves in the club's parking lot and waited. The plan worked. A white van pulled up, and to the police's surprise, Guillaume Mingaud was indeed in the passenger seat. An unknown middle-aged man was driving, but was Elodie inside? Mingaud got out of the car and the police immediately moved to apprehend the suspect. The man tried to flee, but they quickly brought him down and arrested him. The driver of the van didn't resist. He introduced himself as Richard Lignier, a nearby resident and construction worker. He had never had any legal troubles and simply wanted to spend a pleasant evening with his acquaintance. The police searched the van, but it turned out to be empty. Elodie was not inside. Mingaud's belongings were also searched. In his pockets, they found a phone, car keys, and a wallet. Inside the wallet were some documents, a small amount of money, and a bank card in Elodie Morel's name. However, the man had a ready explanation. He claimed he had found the card on the bar's terrace 2 days ago and intended to return it to the bank the following day, but forgot to do so. As for Lignier, he explained that he lived in the commune of Vergese with his wife and teenage daughter. Mingaud had been his friend, and for the past 2 days he had been staying at his house. Mingaud allegedly often stayed with Lignier during his travels before setting out again. The detectives had a hard time believing the two men's stories. Mingaud's explanation about Elodie's bank card seemed far-fetched, and Lignier lived only 8 kilometers from Vouvram, where the last ping from Elodie's mobile phone had been recorded. The police arrested both men and took them to the station for questioning. However, they made a stop on the way, visiting Richard Lignier's home. When the officers arrived at Lignier's house, they encountered the most bizarre and surreal scene of their careers. Richard's wife, Francine Lignier, and their daughter were seated at the table, having lunch. Neither Francine nor the girl reacted to the uninvited guests at all. They continued to eat in silence, as if a group of police officers had not just burst into their home and started searching the premises. This strange reaction left the detectives astounded, as if they had been expected. An unpleasant and oppressive atmosphere pervaded the family's home. Despite this eerie atmosphere, the police meticulously searched the house while the women continued their meal. Elodie herself was nowhere to be found, but indirect evidence of her presence emerged. A black handbag, a floral dress, 2 pairs of high-heeled shoes, and a black sweater. These were the items Elodie had taken with her on her trip. However, the most crucial piece of evidence was Elodie's phone, which was now in the possession of Lignier's daughter. After making these findings, the police decided to take the mother and daughter to the station for further questioning. Interrogating Mingaud proved to be incredibly challenging. He was a master of manipulation and stuck to his story. The police could contradict some of his statements thanks to the evidence they had found, but Mingaud insisted that he had simply found the bank card and intended to return it, period. So the investigators decided to focus more on the Lignier family. They reasoned that it would be easier to get Richard, who had never been in trouble with the law before, to talk than the repeat offender Guillaume Mingaud. With each passing hour of questioning, Richard became more exhausted, and the investigators were confident that he was on the verge of revealing everything. As expected, Richard eventually broke down. He confessed that Guillaume Mingaud had shown up at his house at 6 a.m. on May 3rd while his family was having breakfast. Mingaud claimed to have come with a girl and needed somewhere to hide her. Just a few meters from Richard's house, there was an isolated place, a garage. Richard had no choice but to unlock it and allow Mingaud to drive into the garage. I didn't see what was in the trunk. I didn't hear anything. Mingaud said he would stay overnight in the garage to make sure she wouldn't scream. Richard asked no further questions, returned to the house, washed up, got dressed, and went to work as usual. But it wasn't an ordinary day. There was a young woman in his garage who could be in great danger. Richard was well aware of how cruel and dangerous Mingaud could be, but not once throughout the entire day did he feel the need to contact the police and report what was happening in his garage. After Richard's confession, his wife Francine fully corroborated his account. However, like her husband, she never considered calling the police to report the girl in her garage. She was afraid that by doing so, Mingaud would harm her daughter. She added that on the evening of the same day, May 3rd, Mingaud entered their house, demanding dinner. He had with him a black bag, a dress, 2 pairs of high-heeled shoes, a sweater, and a phone. He handed the items to Richard and Francine as a gift. Francine took the items without asking questions, while she gave the phone to their daughter, as she happened to need a new one. During lunch, Mingo first mentioned that the girl might report him to the police and hinted at his terrible intentions toward her. Upon learning that Linye had revealed everything to the police, Guillaume Mango lost confidence in himself and came up with a new version of events. He admitted to posting a fake message online about upcoming photo shoots for Rolls-Royce. He had posed as the renowned photographer Nicole Forestier and provided enough information to make the photo shoot appear credible. Mingo claimed to be genuinely surprised when Elodie responded to the offer and accused her of falling for an offer that was too good to be true. Regardless, Mingo contacted Elodie by phone, introduced himself as Forestier's assistant Alan Lacoste, and invited her to Aigues-Mortes ostensibly to meet Forestier before the shoot began. After meeting Elodie, he proposed going on a trip to the locations where the photo shoot was planned. She agreed and messaged her husband, assuring him that everything was fine. As he had done in the past, Mango drove Elodie onto a country road. Sensing that they had gone far enough, he attacked her. However, he told the police that all he needed was her bank card and PIN. He claimed that he simply let her go afterward, using her card to make some purchases, refuel his car, and withdraw some cash. This was confirmed by the ATM camera. Mingo denied Linye's claims about the garage and other things. Of course, no one believed that Mingo had lured Elodie to Aigues-Mortes just to steal her bank card. While interrogating him, investigators searched Linye's garage and found several dozen cigarette butts, fingerprints, and DNA evidence from both Guillaume and Elodie. These pieces of evidence confirmed that Elodie had been in the garage with Mingo. Confronted with these facts, Mingo provided yet another version of what happened. He once again claimed that he only needed Elodie's bank card. Supposedly, he did take her to the garage, but it was only to buy some time. He wanted to discuss a plan with Elodie. He would keep her bank card in exchange for her silence. Mingo stated that he was almost ready to release her when she suddenly pushed him. He justified the subsequent violence with his explosive temper. The end of the first week of May was supposed to be the grand finale of the photo shoot for Rolls-Royce. Instead, on May 6th, Mingo was wrapping up his statements about what had occurred. He revealed where he had left Elodie. The police found her black 1995 BMW sedan in the Aigues-Mortes parking lot. The license plates confirmed that it was her car. When detectives opened the trunk, they found Elodie there. She had died from asphyxiation. During the autopsy, more horrifying details of what had happened to Elodie during the harrowing 36 hours she spent in the clutches of her captor, with no one coming to her aid, were uncovered. There's no need to enumerate these details, as one can easily imagine what a criminal of this nature could do to an attractive young woman who had fallen into his trap. Guillaume Mango, Richard, and Francine Linye faced trial in January 2008. During the trial, Mingo once again mocked the feelings of all Elodie's friends and family. Despite all the evidence gathered and his own confession, he claimed that everything was Richard Linye's fault and that he had fallen in love with Elodie at first sight, so he allegedly couldn't harm her. No one bought into his lies, and in February 2008, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. He filed an appeal which was approved. His sentence was reduced to a maximum of 30 years with a minimum of 20 years in prison. Richard and Francine were initially sentenced to 6 years, but their prison terms were increased to 8 years after a year. Sylvain Racine struggled deeply with what happened to his wife and never publicly commented on the case. Elodie's top priority had been to raise her son in a safe and happy home environment, and Sylvain promised himself that he would do everything possible to ensure that. Dominique Tarasco, who first reported the possible kidnapping to the police, understands that his reluctance to reveal Guillaume Mingo's name hindered the timely rescue of Elodie. He acknowledges that he still regrets not fully cooperating with the police. Dominique believes he could have saved Elodie Morel because he knew enough but didn't act on it. He has never been charged in connection with this case.
Brent Poole took his wife's hand and surveyed the stretch of sandy beach between the Atlantic Ocean and vast dunes. They strolled slowly past private beach houses, and as they were engulfed by the darkness of the last untouched miles of forest running alongside the shore, the young man once again marveled at how romantic Myrtle Beach was. Situated between South Carolina and North Carolina, it was at the heart of the popular Grand Strand Beach. Like many tourists before him,
Brent was enchanted by the rhythmic movement of the waves crashing onto the white sandy beach. Hand in hand with his beloved wife, he felt warm and joyful in his heart. Chuckling like a boy, Brent suggested to Renee, "Let's do it right here." The girl smiled and began to undress. A light breeze blowing in from the ocean cooled their naked bodies as the young couple enjoyed each other's company. After a while, Brent helped Renee get dressed, and he checked his watch. It was nearly midnight. They needed to head back to the hotel. Walking back hand in hand, they made plans for the future. In the distance, they noticed a large man dressed in black, his body covered tightly. But it wasn't just his appearance that frightened them. It was the fact that the man, who was initially heading in a different direction, suddenly turned and started following them. They picked up their pace, but they couldn't shake him off. The man ran ahead and leapt in front of them. He wore a ski mask, and in his hands was a gun that he pointed at the young couple. The weapon was black and looked almost like a plastic toy. The man ordered them to lie down on the ground. "This guy is crazy," Renee thought. Brent remembered that he had an army Swiss knife in his pocket, which he bought at a flea market for Christmas. But what could he do with a knife against a gun? The stranger demanded that they hand over all their valuables. After taking their jewelry and money, the robber aimed the gun at Brent. He pulled the trigger once, twice, 3 times, but the gun refused to fire. While the robber confidently reloaded the weapon, a terrified Renee hoped that it was all just a tasteless joke and that he would leave soon. Then the man aimed the gun at Brent again. Brent begged him to spare his life. The robber smirked, glanced at Renee, and asked why he should spare him. "Because I have a daughter whom I love very much," Brent replied firmly. The shooter's eyes narrowed. He put the gun under Brent's chin and made him kneel. He pulled the trigger for the 4th time. Only this time, there was no misfire. Brent probably didn't hear the shot or feel it. But the shooter seemed unsatisfied and fired again. He wanted to make sure Brent was dead, although there was no need. The stranger turned and walked toward Renee, who lay on the sand, trembling with fear. She thought she would be the next one, but the stranger simply turned abruptly and ran toward the dunes. Renee got on her knees and called her husband's name softly through her tears. Just 10 minutes ago, they were celebrating their 3rd wedding anniversary, making plans for the future, joyfully discussing their little daughter Katie's first trip to the ocean. Renee sat by Brent, frightened and shocked. It's unclear how long she stayed in that state, but finally, she realized she needed to call for help. She remembered seeing a patrol car in the distance with her husband. With difficulty, she staggered in that direction. On June 9, 1998, shortly before midnight, Myrtle Beach patrolman Scott Brown was cruising along the deserted coastline of the Grand Strand when the headlights of his SUV suddenly caught sight of a girl frantically waving at him in the darkness. She was in a state of hysteria, and it's not surprising given what she told the patrolman. It was far beyond anything Scott was used to dealing with, like stolen wallets. But a stolen wallet was just the beginning of Renee's story. The masked stranger dressed in black had robbed them, and then he shot her husband twice in the head. The girl recounted how they obediently did everything the stranger told them, but it didn't save them. Scott, who had recently become a patrolman, was stunned upon hearing what had happened. Nonetheless, he quickly got his bearings and called for backup. On the crime scene, the arriving police officers found casings indicating that the perpetrator had used an automatic or semi-automatic weapon, which he took with him. This meant that the criminal was armed and possibly looking for another victim in the popular tourist area of the Grand Strand. The city's police, heavily reliant on tourism, could not afford another murder. They dedicated all their resources to finding the robber. The search led K9 units up to the road, but if the killer had a car, no one had seen it. Meanwhile, the police took Renee to the station, where they checked her hands for gunpowder residue as a precautionary measure. They didn't find any. The police had no reason to suspect her, but the entire scenario of what had happened was troubling. A random beach robbery was unusual in itself, but a robbery and murder on the beach was almost unheard of. The strangest part of Renee's story, from the police's perspective, was that she survived to tell it. If the robber decided to shoot his victim in the head to eliminate a potential witness, then why leave Renee alive? She wasn't even tied up, and she was not struck or gagged. Renee recounted that the gun clicked, as if there were no more bullets left. The casings found on the beach seemed to confirm her words. According to her account, it appeared that it was her lucky day. Meanwhile, the police had the difficult task of informing the parents of the 24-year-old young man that their son had been killed. Interestingly, the first thing the parents asked was whether his wife was with him. And then they revealed to the police the unusual dynamics of the marital couple. Growing up in the suburbs of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Renee always had a way with guys. She caught Brent Pool's eye in a serendipitous encounter in 1991 when they met in the school parking lot. A friend of Brent asked him to give Renee a ride home, and during that ride, Brent invited her on a date. Their whirlwind romance led to the news that they would become parents in March 1995, just 3 months after Renee turned 17. Brent proposed to Renee, traditionally getting down on one knee. Both of their families were unsure if they would be able to handle the responsibilities of parenthood. Fortunately, at 21 years old, Brent already had a promising career as a mechanic, working double shifts and making a decent income for a young man. Brent and Renee even managed to buy a small house in a residential area near Winston-Salem. At first glance, it seemed like things were going well for the young couple, but after the birth of their daughter in 1996, financial problems began to arise. To overcome their financial struggles, at Brent's suggestion, Renee took up a job as an exotic dancer at a local club in the spring of the following year. Brent was proud of his wife's job, and Renee enjoyed her new lifestyle. Her new job promised to help the family forget about their financial woes, with earnings ranging from $200 to $400 per night. However, Renee brought more than just cash home from the club. She became involved with some of her female co-workers, and according to rumors circulating in the club, Brent was supportive of these relationships. It seemed that he was open to experimenting in their marriage. But one of Renee's affairs turned out to be more serious than she had anticipated. In the spring of 1998, Renee began dating John Boyd Frazier, a computer systems technician and a DJ from the club. John was a pleasant young man, known for being generous with the ladies. Rumors suggested that this aspect of him was what attracted Renee to him. As Brent spent more time with his friends and, in Renee's opinion, didn't help her enough with their child, she decided to pack her bags, take their 2-year-old daughter, and move in with John. However, just a few days after the move, Renee met with a lawyer who explained to her that given her occupation as an exotic dancer and her relatively liberal views on relationships, she was unlikely to secure full custody of her daughter. This made Renee reconsider her decision to leave her husband. Renee packed her things and returned home to her husband. Brent, who was willing to do anything to keep Renee, welcomed her back with open arms. To celebrate their reconciliation, the whole family went on vacation to Myrtle Beach. The family vacation started off wonderfully, with them all enjoying a few days basking in the sun on the beach. However, on the evening of June 9th, on the 3rd anniversary of their wedding, Renee and Brent decided to spend the evening just the two of them. Renee had arranged for a babysitter for their daughter, Katie, at the hotel, but when the sitter arrived, their plans were almost derailed as Katie started crying. Brent tried to comfort their daughter, but Renee practically pushed him out of the hotel room. The couple visited 2 night spots, had dinner, and had a few cocktails. Then, a little after 11 o'clock, they decided to take advantage of the many secluded spots near their hotel. What happened next was known to the police. Upon learning the name of Renee's lover, the Myrtle Beach police called Salem to request an immediate visit to John's house and verify if he was there. They also spoke with Renee again. She confirmed the statements made by Brent's parents. Renee admitted that she had been involved with other men, including her affair with John, but claimed that all those affairs were in the past. However, she was uncertain if John agreed with her on this. Under pressure from the detectives, Renee admitted that she wasn't sure. By 5 a.m. on June 10th, Brent had been dead for 5 hours, and the Myrtle Beach police had a suspect in the murder, John Frazier. Detectives found out that he had called in sick to work on that day when he was supposed to be working. Unfortunately for the investigators, when they knocked on John's door, he was at home. It was almost impossible for him to travel to Myrtle Beach, commit the crime, return, change clothes, and then open the door for the police. The police had no choice but to apologize, wish him a good night, and leave. The police took up the investigation again with Renee. She came to the station accompanied by a lawyer, not a criminal defense attorney, but one who had helped her sister in her divorce. Renee repeated her story when suddenly her lawyer interrupted the conversation. He asked to speak with his client alone. But just when the investigators thought the conversation was over, they faced an unexpected surprise. Upon returning to the interrogation room, the lawyer instructed Renee to tell everything she knew. And Renee confessed that John was the one who pulled the trigger that night. She recognized him by his voice and mannerisms. Justifying herself, she claimed that she had to convince herself first that it was him. Now the police had to find out how John ended up on a secluded beach in another city on June 9th. Fortunately, a witness appeared at the right time. Bruce Wolford, a bartender at the club where Renee worked and John's friend, heard Renee talking to John about her plans to go to Myrtle Beach with her husband for their wedding anniversary. He also mentioned seeing John attempting to fight Brent on one occasion. In John's daily planner, the police found a note under June 9th that said Renee and Brent, although it was later discovered that he simply marked all the important dates of his friends and acquaintances. John was immediately arrested, but unlike Renee, he didn't give away a single word. The investigators believed that they would get the whole story from Renee. She made a mistake when she recanted her initial testimony. She was arrested right next to the funeral home and taken in for questioning. The detective did everything possible to extract information from Renee, even if it meant deceiving her. Although John Frazier refused to speak, the detective falsely told Renee that John had confessed to killing her husband at her request. They threatened her, saying that she would never see her daughter again unless she accused John of the crime and revealed where he had hidden the weapon. Gradually, after a 2-hour interrogation, Renee's story began to change. She confessed that she knew about John's threats to kill Brent but didn't take her lover's words seriously. The next day, Renee was accused of murder, and the prosecutor decided to insist on the harshest punishment for her. Her defense attorney, who specializes in criminal cases, demanded that she withdraw her confession. The case against Renee was essentially based on the fact that John was the shooter. However, the prosecutors faced serious difficulties. Apart from Renee's confession, they had no other evidence. To prove that Renee lured her husband out of the hotel room to set up John as the shooter, they needed a witness who could link her lover to the crime scene. And they found 2 witnesses right away. 2 elderly individuals were also staying at the same hotel as the couple and coincidentally celebrating their wedding anniversary there. On the day after the murder, they contacted the police to report that they had been on the beach the previous evening and saw a man dressed in black who frightened them. They identified John from a photograph, claiming that he appeared suspicious and they remembered his face. Although this statement immediately raised many doubts because it was nighttime and the beach had limited lighting, making it unlikely for them to clearly see a man at a considerable distance. Nevertheless, the prosecutors attempted to convict Renee, hoping that her accomplice would then admit guilt. Renee's guilt hinged on what she knew about John's plan. However, if John was not the murderer, then she had no connection to the crime at all. Detectives managed to pressure the shocked girl into confessing, which became the primary evidence against her in the case. Renee lost 15 pounds during this ordeal. They desperately needed a confession to prevent tourists from fearing to visit the city. It was crucial for them to portray Brent's death as something other than a random robbery. Renee's defense attorney believes that she was convicted for her lifestyle. However, the prosecutors argued that her lifestyle had a more significant impact on Brent. Being unfaithful to her husband and working in such a profession made divorce not an option for her. It seemed more logical to get rid of Brent. Her reunion with her husband was just one step in her fatal betrayal because being with her boyfriend during her husband's murder did not play in her favor. The jury deliberated for a long time and finally found the prosecution's arguments more compelling. Kimberly Renee Poole was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The trial of John, who had no intention of admitting guilt, took place shortly after that. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison despite the lack of actual evidence against him. The prosecutors didn't even call Bruce Woolfolk to testify. If Bruce had been a reliable witness, the prosecutors would have been eager to put him on the stand and convince the jury that John was the only person with a motive to remove Brent Poole from the picture. The problem was that there were several people who liked Renee and saw her husband as an obstacle, and Bruce Woolford was at the top of that list. Darrell Wilson, a private detective hired by John Fraser's mother, thoroughly investigated the case and came to the conclusion that Bruce was just as likely a suspect as John. The former police officer spoke not only with Bruce but also with many other witnesses involved in the case. In particular, he found Chris Hensley, another witness completely ignored by the police, who had a much better view and recollection of what happened on the beach that night. Firstly, he deduced what Renee and Brent were doing on the beach after seeing Brent's unbuttoned shirt. Secondly, he encountered a man dressed in black who passed very close to him, and Chris even greeted him out of politeness. According to Chris, the composite sketch based on his description didn't resemble John at all. However, when the private detective showed Chris a computer-generated composite and pictures of Bruce, Chris stated that the man in the photo matched the composite sketch very closely based on what he remembered about the person's height, hair, and face. Even more incriminating was the fact that Bruce had installed spyware on Renee's home computer, giving him complete control over her computer. This allowed him to monitor Renee's activities for 6 months, knowing everything about her whereabouts and plans, and reading all her emails and messages. Bruce became even more suspicious given that he owned a semi-automatic pistol and had access to a white van with a number sticker on the window, similar to the one witnesses saw on the beach before the murder. By killing Brent and framing John for the crime, Bruce could eliminate 2 rivals at once. After the trial, a campaign for the review of Renee's case began. Her new attorney filed an appeal on the grounds that her predecessor had performed poorly in her duties. The court-appointed public defender only met with Renee once before the trial, and that was just to push her to agree to a 30-year sentence in exchange for confessing to conspiracy to commit murder. The prosecutors implanted in the minds of the jury the idea that there was no robbery at all because approximately a month after the murder, Brent's wallet was found in the yard of a nearby house with $9 in cash, Brent's driver's license, and a bank card he used to pay for dinner at a restaurant. However, the defense attorney could easily prove that $50 were missing from Brent's wallet, which he had withdrawn from an ATM on the night of the murder to pay the babysitter. Moreover, the babysitter's testimony about Renee's alleged haste was misinterpreted. The babysitter could only sit with the child from 9 p.m. to 12 a.m., and she got lost, took some time to find the right hotel, and was 15 minutes late. Therefore, Renee was in a hurry to go for a walk with her husband just to spend more time with him within the 3-hour time frame allocated for babysitting. These are not all the facts that were not presented by the defense at the trial. In particular, there were electronic emails confirming that it was Brent who suggested going to Myrtle Beach. So, it wasn't Renee who lured her husband to a secluded beach. It was Brent who wanted to add some excitement to their intimate life, which is why they bought a beach towel on the way back from the restaurant at 10:52 p.m. Since they were supposed to go back home the next day, it was their last evening when Brent's desire could be fulfilled. Everything happened spontaneously. If it was premeditated, Renee would have taken a small towel with her to ensure nothing hindered the execution of her plan. Moreover, if the murder was planned, it would have been more logical for Renee to keep her husband in a secluded, wooded area until her accomplice arrived. However,
The crime occurred as they were returning to the hotel. When they noticed a stranger following them, they hurried their pace. Brent even had time to draw his knife and potentially alter the situation in his favor. The Brent family has initiated an investigation along this path, claiming that Renee is responsible for everything. They have turned against her, blaming her for the moral choices their son made and desired. Renee's attorney should emphasize that Brent himself wanted her to work as a stripper and engage in relationships with other people, undermining the prosecution's theory. As Renee continues to fight for what is called mitigation of punishment after the verdict, she serves her sentence in prison. Brent's parents have been granted custody of Katie, although Renee managed to build a healthy and loving relationship with her daughter. In prison, Renee creates Braille textbooks for blind children, and her colleagues and supervisors highly value her work. To this day, she maintains her claim of innocence and insists that she does not know who robbed them with Brent and shot her husband. Several years before the John Benet Ramsey case, America was trying to solve the mystery of the disappearance of 7-year-old Jacqueline Dovalibi. Was she abducted by a stranger who entered her home under the cover of night? Or did she become a victim within her own family? The police were convinced that the culprits were always in plain sight, whereas no one who knew the family doubted their complete innocence. Midlothian, located in the state of Illinois, USA, is a small town where everyone knows each other. It is situated approximately 30 minutes south of the bustling streets of Chicago and is considered a quiet suburb where there is always a sense of being in a familiar place. However, in 1988, the town changed forever when 7-year-old Jacqueline Dovalibi disappeared from her own bedroom in the middle of the night. Jacqueline lived in a cozy, ranch-style home with her parents, David and Cynthia, and her 4-year-old brother, Davy. The family resided in a beautiful location, surrounded by several nature preserves, all within walking distance from their home. Jacqueline's biological father, Jimmy Guess, had no involvement in her life after a bitter divorce from Cynthia shortly after their daughter was born. David Dovalibi adopted Jacqueline when he married Cynthia 5 years ago when Jacqueline was 2 years old, and he was the only father she knew. Cynthia worked as a dietitian at the local hospital, and David was a carpenter who had been promoted to a foreman. David and Jacqueline had an instant connection, often going fishing and bowling together. According to one neighbor whose daughter was friends with Jacqueline, she was a happy little girl who never showed any signs of sadness or anger. According to all accounts, the Dovalibis were a typical, close-knit suburban family. On the evening of September 10, 1988, Cynthia took Jacqueline and Davy to a nearby KFC Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant, while David met up with his friends and went bowling. When all family members returned home, they watched television, and Jacqueline, wearing her favorite purple and white pajamas, kissed Cynthia and David goodnight. What exactly happened in the house that night remains unclear, but the next morning, the little brunette with brown eyes was no longer there. David and his son woke up earlier than the other family members on the next morning, and around 7:45, David noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. At first, he thought that his mother, who lived with the family, had left it open and didn't worry much about it. He prepared breakfast for Davy and turned on the television. A little later, Cynthia woke up and went to wake up their daughter but couldn't find Jacqueline in her bedroom. The parents called Jacqueline's friends, thinking that she might have gone outside to play. While they searched for the child inside the house and in the neighborhood, Cynthia noticed that the basement window was broken and wide open. David immediately called the police and reported his daughter's disappearance. After investigators arrived at the house, Cynthia and David explained that none of them had heard anything unusual during the night, and they had all been sound asleep. Nothing was missing from the house except Jacqueline's blanket, which matched the colors of her pajamas. Furthermore, there were no signs of a struggle. Investigators needed to determine whether someone had broken into the house and taken Jacqueline, or if she had left the house herself, only to be taken by someone else. Although there were no phone calls or ransom notes, the FBI agents took over the investigation, presuming that they were dealing with a kidnapping rather than a runaway case. Soon, the news of a possible abduction spread throughout the town. The suburb mainly consisted of families with young children, and the possibility that someone had broken into a family's home and abducted their little girl in the middle of the night while everyone was asleep was a horrifying revelation. Considering that there were no signs of a struggle, investigators began to wonder if the girl might have left with someone she knew. If the intruder had entered the house through the broken basement window,
They needed to be familiar with the layout of the house to enter the girl's room without waking the other family members, investigators concluded. We are looking at it with an open mind as a potential abduction, but also as an abduction with someone known to the family, said Police Captain John Bitton. This statement led Cynthia to recall an unsettling incident that occurred several years earlier. After a bitter custody battle during which her former partner, Jimmy Guest, did everything in his power to keep their daughter with him, he had broken into their home and attempted to take their daughter. Therefore, Cynthia suspected his involvement in Jacqueline's disappearance because she knew he was capable of such actions. Jacqueline's grandmother, Anne Dovalibi, admits that she wasn't initially worried about her granddaughter's safety because she believed that Jacqueline had been taken by her biological father, and she was confident they would quickly get her back. However, she couldn't have known that Jimmy had been in prison in Florida for the previous 4 months during Jacqueline's disappearance and was soon ruled out as a suspect. Suspicion also fell on Jacqueline's uncle, Timothy Guest, who lived nearby and suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. However, he had an alibi. It was at this point that Cynthia began to worry that something bad had happened to her daughter. The parents of the girl, Cynthia and David, were questioned multiple times in the following days. They didn't hide anything. They explained that Jacqueline had gone to bed at 10 p.m., and when Cynthia went to check on her at 11 p.m., she was sound asleep. The police became increasingly skeptical of the parents' story. It was difficult for them to believe that a person unfamiliar with the layout of the house could have crawled through the basement window without disturbing the towel dryer right beneath the window. Then, they would have had to walk down the hallway to the girl's room and take her away without waking any of the other family members. The only sign that a stranger had been in the house was the broken window. No fingerprints or signs of a struggle were found. Indeed, when it comes to fingerprints and other evidence, it's important to note that the police themselves made a series of mistakes that could have influenced their conclusions. They never secured the girl's room to prevent anyone from entering it, and they didn't thoroughly search the house. A forensic expert took photographs, but he didn't even bother to take close-up pictures of the broken window. He checked the window and the front door for fingerprints, but not the back door. What was even more astonishing was that the police allowed friends of the family to clean up their house and even sweep away the glass from the broken window. The police just stood by and watched as they cleaned up, destroying any evidence that the kidnapper might have left behind. Immediately after the girl's disappearance, Jacqueline's parents were asked to take a polygraph test. Cynthia was too distraught for such a test. Friends recall that she was in a terrible state, constantly feeling nauseous. David underwent the polygraph test, which he passed. But in the minds of the police, everything seemed to point to the parents. The number of potential suspects sharply narrowed after one of the forensic experts stated that, in his opinion, the basement window had been broken from the inside. On September 14th, 5 days after the girl's disappearance, the parents attempted to take a polygraph test again. Cynthia's results were inconclusive due to her emotional state. David's results were also inconclusive, and the polygraph examiner accused him of not cooperating with the investigation. David in turn claimed that the polygraph examiner instructed him to answer yes to all questions, including the question, "Did you kill your daughter?" to which David refused to answer yes. Afterward, David was taken into an interrogation room and was not released for 5 hours. Later that evening, Michael Chapman pulled into the parking lot of the Islander Apartments on 1912 Canal Street in Blue Island, a town located about 5 kilometers from the girl's home. When Chapman exited his car, he noticed an unpleasant odor in the fresh autumn air. He spotted something wrapped up in the grass, which he described as a wrapped-up object. As he approached, he saw a head and a hand, and he immediately ran inside to call the police. Jacqueline's body was discovered, and she was still bound with a 2-meter rope, which was considered evidence of the crime. Her soiled underwear was found about 60 centimeters from her body. As for the police, they continued to question Jacqueline's father for about 1.5 hours without informing him that his daughter had been found. They tried to convince him to confess to the crime. When Officer Kevin Shaughnessy finally told him about Jacqueline's discovery, David didn't believe him, thinking it was another police trick to make him confess. This is likely why he responded with the phrase, "I guess you think I should cry now?" However, Officer Shaughnessy interpreted these words differently, and they convinced him not to pursue other suspects. In any case, there was no evidence against David, and he was released to go home.
where he found his distraught wife and realized that his daughter was truly gone. By morning, with the help of dental records, the body was officially identified as Jacqueline de Wallaby. Initially, based solely on the appearance of the body, there was speculation that she had been struck on the head, but the Cook County coroner, Dr. Robert Stein, stated that the condition of the body was the result of rapid decomposition due to the unusually warm September weather. Dr. Stein could not determine with certainty whether the girl had been sexually assaulted or not due to the state of decomposition. Although the exact time of death couldn't be determined either, Robert Stein concluded that she had been dead for several days, and the terrible crime was most likely committed early Saturday morning, right after her disappearance. After the body was identified, and given that they had been individually questioned for hours before Jacqueline was found, both Cynthia and David hired lawyers who advised them to invoke their Fifth Amendment rights and not answer any more questions from investigators. They had already told the police everything they knew, provided blood and urine samples, and gave permission for investigators to examine any family medical records that might be relevant. They also allowed investigators access to their home for all 5 days that Jacqueline was missing. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution allows citizens to refuse to answer any questions that may incriminate them. The de Wallabys had every right to invoke the Fifth Amendment. However, with no other suspects, law enforcement focused their attention on Cynthia and David as the primary suspects and claimed that it was suspicious that they were not cooperating with investigators. Police rushed to accuse the family of refusing to cooperate with the investigation. Prosecutor Patrick O'Brien explained, "Even if you are being looked at as a suspect, and you know deep down inside that you didn't do this, and it's unfair, the idea of not cooperating with the police that are investigating the murder of your daughter seems overly concerned about your personal interests." On the day after the funeral, a team of 20 police officers executed search warrants at the de Wallaby home. They emerged from the house with several large bags containing items they wanted to examine in the laboratory. Additionally, they confiscated the family's blue Chevrolet Malibu. Months passed, but there were no updates or new information about the case. However, the police made a statement indicating that the family members had not been excluded as suspects. Cynthia's lawyer, Lawrence Hyman, criticized the police investigation, calling it a blatant violation of the law. While Cynthia and David continued to avoid communicating with the media, they had a multitude of supporters. Neighbors stood by the family, telling journalists that the de Wallabys were a loving and caring family, and they had never heard either of the parents raise their voice at Jacqueline or Davy. David's boss, Ross Patterson, recalled, "The only time David took a day off work was when he needed to get documents for Jacqueline's adoption." However, this did not convince the investigators. Adhering to the theory that Cynthia and David could be involved in the crime, they returned to the location where the body was found and began showing photos of Cynthia, David, and their car to residents of the Islander apartments, hoping to find any witnesses who might have seen them in the area. On November 22nd, Cynthia and David were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Their son Davy was placed under the care of the Department of Family and Children's Services. It became known that a tenant of the apartment complex where the body was found had told investigators that he had seen David in a blue Chevy Malibu in the parking lot. A witness, a 35-year-old city transportation worker named Everett Mann, said that around 2 a.m. on September 10th, he was pulling into the parking lot, and his headlights illuminated a blue Chevy with a driver he claimed was David de Wallaby. During Cynthia and David's arrest, they were deliberately paraded in front of the media so that as many photos as possible could be taken, seemingly to convey the message, "Look, we've done our job." Detectives boasted about having a wealth of evidence against David and Cynthia, including 2 witnesses. However, it remained unclear why loving parents would act this way towards their daughter. Were there enough pieces of evidence? Or were the investigators rushing to take the case to court for some reason? Perhaps the answer to this question lies in the fact that on the same day as the parents' arrest, a major news story emerged. Richard M. Daley, the state's chief prosecutor whose office was handling the case, announced his candidacy for mayor of Chicago. Critics accused him of using a high-profile crime in his political game, but despite the criticism, Daley became the mayor of Chicago, and the case was handed over to the court. It is widely known that eyewitness testimonies are highly unreliable.
Nevertheless, the witness statements suggesting that David was near the crime scene were enough to charge him and his wife with first-degree murder. Blue Island Police Chief Paul Greaves referred to these witness testimonies as excellent evidence that allowed them to rule out other leads.
The police never disclosed what those other leads were, but relying solely on witness testimony to exclude all other possibilities seemed somewhat prejudicial, especially considering that Cynthia was not linked to the crime scene. Both spouses were denied bail, and it was revealed that Cynthia was in the early stages of pregnancy. In the search for new evidence, the police decided to focus on the couple's 5-year-old son, Davy, who was examined by a doctor. Supposedly, the doctor found traces on his body that could have resulted from a belt, some of which were old while others were recent. The police suspected that Cynthia and David had abused Davy at home, suggesting it could be a motive for the crime. Patrick Murphy, Davy's state-appointed guardian, said that the police and prosecutors continuously questioned the child for days. He added that after speaking with Davy and reviewing his medical records, he couldn't understand how they arrived at such a conclusion because he couldn't find anything that indicated violence against the child. He also mentioned that Davy constantly pleaded to see his parents, and he missed them greatly. In mid-December, Cynthia and David were released on bail, but Davy was not allowed to return home with his parents. He was placed in the custody of David's sister Rose and her husband John. Davy was only allowed to see his parents during supervised visits. In April 1990, the court proceedings began. It became clear early on that the evidence gathered by law enforcement was not as compelling as initially reported. The prosecutors didn't even have a clear motive for the crime, but fortunately for them, they were not legally obligated to provide one. Their main argument was straightforward. There were no outsiders in the house, so the Dovelebys must be guilty. The defense argued that due to the poor police work, it was impossible to determine how the intruder had entered the house and what had transpired inside during that night. The idea that the intruder needed to know the layout of the house to find Jacqueline's bedroom seemed far-fetched. The family lived in a typical ranch-style house. Many such houses are built with a similar layout. Anyone who had ever been inside a similar house would likely know the layout. The prosecutors also tried to argue that the intruder had to navigate through a window without disturbing objects below, such as a vanity, a TV stand, and a towel rack. To demonstrate that this was possible, David filmed a video showing how a neighbor climbed through the basement window, propped his leg on the wall, and didn't disturb any objects below. Furthermore, it turned out that the prosecution had only one witness, not two. Everett Mann, the key prosecution witness, admitted during the trial that he had identified David solely by his prominent nose. He was about 70 meters away from the man in the parking lot and only remembered his distinctive nose, as it was dark and the lighting was quite dim. Moreover, during the photo identification, Everett was shown a frontal picture of David, while he had only seen the person in profile. Additionally, David's photo was much larger than the 4 photos of other men. Everett admitted that the person he saw that night could have been African American or Caucasian, or even a man or a woman, and all he saw was a silhouette that only looked male. In a night without moonlight, 3 weeks into the trial, the jury members were taken to the same parking lot where Everett had supposedly seen David. They stood in the same spot under similar conditions as Everett. They could hardly see anything. In reality, they couldn't even notice a nearby garbage can, which was said to be near where the car was parked. Several neighbors of the Dovelebys also contradicted the witness's account regarding the car. The defense lawyers built their case around the fact that a remarkably similar crime occurred in the same neighborhood about a year after Jacqueline's abduction. On September 2, 1989, Perry Hernandez broke into a home in Blue Island and kidnapped a 6-year-old girl while her family slept. He entered by breaking a window and made his way inside without waking anyone. The man took the girl to a railroad bridge near the Calumet River, tormented her, and then allowed her to return home. This happened within 1.5 miles of where Jacqueline was found. An interesting detail emerged. The girl Hernandez was living with at the time also owned a Chevy Malibu, and Perry often stayed overnight at her apartment. In fact, even on the night before Jacqueline's disappearance, someone had entered another home in Midlothian. Elizabeth Siki woke up in the middle of the night and thwarted an attempted robbery or abduction of her daughter. She identified the person she saw in her home that night as Perry Hernandez
and expressed confidence that he intended to abduct her 7-year-old daughter, whom she found tightly wrapped in 3 towels, as if someone had intended to take her away. While this may seem like more than a coincidence, Judge Richard Neville stated that he did not consider this evidence and prohibited Cynthia and David's defense from presenting these facts in court. However, the little girl abducted by Perry Hernandez was invited to testify. She recalled that while she was with the kidnapper under the bridge, he held a rope, as if threatening her with it. Besides the striking similarities between the 2 cases, this demonstrated that a small child could indeed be taken from a bedroom without waking anyone. However, in court, the defense made a mistake by failing to establish a connection with the jury members. They wanted David to take the witness stand and firmly declare his innocence, looking them in the eye. But that didn't happen. The most significant obstacle for the defense turned out to be the 17 autopsy photographs and remains presented to the jury. The prosecutors claimed that the photos were meant to help determine the time and cause of death. The defense believed that these photos simply contributed to bias among the jury members. An attorney explains, "You're shown a beautiful girl next to a photograph of her body, and of course the jury members thought someone must pay for this crime. However, the photos didn't convince the judge, who dropped the charges against Cynthia because her only connection to the crime was being in the house. The judge ordered to keep his decision secret because David's fate still lay in the hands of the jury due to the testimony of Everett Mann. After 14 hours, the jury delivered their verdict: guilty." Everyone believed that David would be acquitted, and the media were already waiting for him outside the courthouse for interviews. It was a shock to everyone that he was found guilty. The judge sentenced David to 45 years in prison. Many didn't understand why the jury had no doubts about his guilt, but suddenly everything fell into place. In an interview with a reporter, the jury foreperson confessed why a guilty verdict was reached. It turns out that the jury saw photographs of the Dovalibi home. In one photo, the bedroom door of young Davy showed a dent from a fist, and the jurors believed this indicated David Dovalibi's violent nature. Coming to this conclusion, the jury members decided that there had been a lot of violence in the house. How wrong they were. The fist-sized dent had appeared long before David moved into the house with Cynthia, and perhaps even before Jacqueline's birth. David's younger brother had struck the door with his fist when he was a teenager. The house belonged to David's mother, and the family always had more important things to spend money on, and the door was never replaced. Neither the defense nor the prosecution mentioned this dent, so the jury's decision was based on things that were not even discussed in court. The jury foreperson added that if they had their way, they would have accused Cynthia as well. During this time, Cynthia fought for custody of Davy. Several psychologists and social workers testified, stating that there was no hint that Davy had ever been mistreated, and Cynthia was a kind and loving mother who doted on Davy, and he on her. By mid-July, Davy was allowed to return home to his mother and his recently born sister, Carly Marie. The fact that the jury was biased against David needed to be used to challenge the verdict. Cynthia and the family's friends formed a committee to fight for David's release. One committee member offered a $10,000 reward for any information about the crime. Additionally, the committee allowed them to connect with people who could assist with the case. One of those people turned out to be Robert Byman, an attorney from the Chicago law firm Jenner and Block, who volunteered to work on the case pro bono. Initially, due to police statements, he also believed in David's guilt, but after studying the case materials, he realized there was no evidence against him at all. He understood that David was wrongly accused due to human nature. Byman explained, 12 good and decent members of the jury were entrusted with deciding the fate of this case. Their choice was simple, to stand up and leave, saying, "Sorry, Jacqueline, we can't do anything for you," or to convict the only person sitting before them. They chose the latter. In October, Robert Byman filed a petition for David's release based on new evidence. Gerald Bauman, a prisoner at Cook County Jail, claimed that he had overheard Perry Hernandez confess to the murder. However, after the petition was filed, Gerald refused to sign his previously given sworn statements, fearing for his safety, and claimed that he had received threats after news of this new evidence came to light. The appeal garnered such a significant response that, for the first time, the Illinois Appellate Court allowed video recording of the case proceedings. The Illinois Appellate Court had 3 options: uphold the guilty verdict, order a new trial, or completely exonerate David, which would mean he could never be tried for this case again. 5 months later, the court's decision was announced. Complete exoneration. The court ruled that the chief witness's testimony had been inaccurate and unreliable, and the prosecutors had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that David was the only person with the opportunity to commit the crime. The judges noted that all the basement windows had been left unlocked that night, and any of them could have allowed the perpetrator inside, but unfortunately they were not checked for fingerprints. They also criticized the decision to show the jury 17 gruesome body photographs that were unnecessary. On November 13, 1991, after spending 18 months in prison, David walked free. I've been a lawyer for almost 30 years, and in all that time there have only been 3 times when I was as happy as I was the day I walked David Dovalibi out of prison. Our judicial system is designed to work in 95% of cases. This time the system failed. It convicted an innocent man, said Robert Byman. However, the Dovalibi family was about to experience yet another shocking turn of events in one of the most paradoxical and unusual murder sagas in modern Chicago history. It became known that Rob Warden and David Protess, who were writing a book about the case titled Gone in the Night, had discovered a new potential suspect. Timothy Guess was a 31-year-old brother of Jacqueline's biological father. Timothy had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and lived in a house with his mother not far from Jacqueline's home. Initially, he claimed to have been working at the Park Avenue restaurant in Harvey on the night of the murder, and 3 restaurant employees confirmed his alibi. However, now 2 of them had recanted their statements. At least 5 regulars of the establishment also claimed that Timothy wasn't there that night. Warden and Protess spoke to Timothy, who told them that he often heard voices in his head and suffered from memory lapses. He told them that he was guided by a spirit, and this spirit had allowed him to describe the layout of the Dovalibi house, even though he had never been inside. He could even describe how to get to Jacqueline's bedroom. Timothy described the blanket in which the body was wrapped, and somehow knew that the light in the bedroom was off on the night of her disappearance. However, Timothy was never seriously considered a suspect even after this information came to light. He passed away in 2002. Protest said, "I felt that the case was solved, but I never thought anyone would be held accountable for the crime. The state would be too embarrassed to admit they had wrongly accused Cynthia and David." Since then, the Dovalibi family has moved and changed their last name due to the excessive attention on their lives. They still hope that Jacqueline's murder will be solved. Something terrible happened in that ranch-style home in Midlothian, Illinois, on the night of September 9, 1988. But 3 decades later, there are still no answers as to what exactly transpired. While the local police claim the case is open, there are evidently no leads being pursued. Every U.S. citizen has the right to invoke the Fifth Amendment, but when Cynthia and David exercised that right, they found themselves at the center of a wrongly and negligently conducted investigation. 1990. 31-year-old Peggy Marshall was at the peak of her career. Armed with a degree in physical therapy, she founded a geriatric clinic in Newport Beach, California. Peggy was passionate about her work, enjoying helping her elderly patients, but what she truly longed for was love. Her dream came true that same year when she met 24-year-old volleyball player Eric Beckler. Peggy and Eric both loved sports, which became their shared passion. Just a few months after meeting, they became inseparable. They lived together in Peggy's apartment and worked together at her clinic. Eric handled the finances, while Peggy provided physical therapy services. Together they made a great team, and the business quickly grew, along with their bank account. Before this, Eric didn't have much of a career, but thanks to his girlfriend, his financial situation improved dramatically, and he enjoyed a stable and wonderful life in a great neighborhood. Soon after their magical wedding ceremony, Peggy Beckler learned that she was expecting a child. But the growing family didn't significantly change their lifestyle. The couple simply brought their daughter with them to the beach. Not long after their first child, a second arrived, and the family moved into a beautiful home they bought for $1 million. They hired 2 nannies, one for weekdays and one for weekends, especially since a third child had arrived. This was the big family Peggy had always dreamed of, like the one she grew up in herself. Thus, the 5th anniversary of the Becklers' marriage quietly arrived. On July 6, 1997, Gary Green, along with a large group of friends and family, was heading from Newport Beach to Catalina Island on his boat when he noticed a boat circling in the ocean. Nearby, a man on a surfboard was struggling in the water, calling for help. Gary Green threw him a life jacket to keep him from drowning and called the Coast Guard. When they arrived, they saw the boat displaying a phenomenon known as the Circle of Death. This happens when the person controlling the boat lets go of the steering mechanism while the engine is running and the propeller is still spinning. Ideally, the operator should be connected to a safety lanyard, which would immediately shut off the engine if they were thrown overboard. However, people often ignore this rule. So when the steering mechanism is released, the force of the spinning propeller creates torque, causing the boat to make sharp turns and continuously rotate in a circle. The Coast Guard was able to stop the boat. They also pulled the man from the water and brought him back to the harbor. He was freezing, panicked, and in tears. The man was Eric Beckler, and his wife, Peggy Beckler, had been on the boat with him. A rescue operation for Peggy immediately began. At that point, she had been in the water for less than 2 hours, and the Coast Guard was hopeful that the rescue would be successful. Peggy was an extraordinarily strong swimmer. At an early age, she was diagnosed with scoliosis and had to wear a back brace. She was only allowed to take it off while swimming, so she spent a lot of time in the water. Swimming became second nature to her. There was a very high chance that Peggy was at least keeping herself afloat while they searched for her. The key was to pinpoint her location as accurately as possible. To aid the rescue operation, the Coast Guard spoke with Eric. He was distraught, shaking, and crying, but he managed to explain that they had been celebrating Peggy's birthday and their 5th wedding anniversary that day. In the morning, he woke his wife up and announced that they were going to the beach. There, a surprise awaited her. Eric had rented a speedboat with a fairly powerful engine. However, it was easy to handle, even for beginners. The couple initially planned to swim in the harbor but soon grew bolder and ventured farther into the ocean for some excitement. For a couple with no experience in ocean boating, renting a speedboat and heading out into the ocean was quite ambitious. But they were enjoying their time. They had a picnic, drank margaritas, and made love. Eventually, they decided to head back. Peggy was at the helm, while Eric wanted to take one more ride on a boogie board. This type of surfing involves catching a wave while lying on your stomach on a relatively small board. As they approached the harbor, they were hit by what's known as a rogue wave or a killer wave, which completely engulfed Eric. When he resurfaced, Peggy was no longer on the boat. The boat itself was circling, making it impossible to get close. He couldn't swim away either, as he was still hoping to see Peggy on the water's surface. The Coast Guard officers were slightly puzzled by the fact that the weather conditions that day were surprisingly favorable for a sea trip. There were no waves and only a light breeze. They mentioned this to Eric, but he stood by his story. The investigators didn't argue. Although there had been no reports of rogue waves, they could have gone unnoticed. The ocean is an unpredictable place. Even in calm weather, many factors, wind, currents, tides, can combine to form unexpected, sometimes deadly waves. Hours passed, evening came, but the Coast Guard helicopters and boats continued to search for Peggy. Even Navy submarines joined the search efforts. As night fell, confidence in a successful rescue began to fade. If the current had carried her away, she could have ended up in Santa Barbara or even Mexico. Peggy Beckler was searched for relentlessly for several days, but in the end, the difficult decision was made to call off the search. The Coast Guard focused on examining the boat. First, they made sure there were no mechanical issues that could have caused the accident. Then, they tried to recreate the situation the couple had been in. All the experiments showed that no matter how the boat rocked, the person steering it should have fallen inside the boat, not into the water. There was another odd detail. A pair of sunglasses was found near the steering mechanism. If Peggy had been swept away by a wave, the glasses should have fallen overboard, along with other items which should have been in disarray, but nothing of the sort was observed. Suspicion grew, and the Coast Guard asked the Homicide Investigation Department to look into the case. It was only later that forensic experts examined the boat. However, since the Coast Guard initially treated the case as an accident, most of the evidence had been lost. Under the mattress, the investigators found a small stain that looked like blood. The amount was too small to extract DNA or even determine the blood type. They couldn't even confirm if it was human blood or from a fish. Nevertheless, this didn't stop the investigators from questioning Eric about the discovery. Eric explained that his wife was on her period, and since they had been intimate, something could have gotten on the mattress. A reasonable explanation, but the detectives weren't ready to take his word for it. The boat was treated with luminol to detect traces of blood, and they found a whole pool of blood that had been carefully cleaned. It was invisible to the naked eye. Unfortunately, too much time had passed, and it was now impossible to determine when the blood had appeared or who had cleaned it up. Besides, Eric seemed so distraught over his wife's disappearance. No one believed that he could have killed his beloved wife. Moreover, there was another theory regarding her disappearance. Peggy and Eric had been spending too much money. Eric hadn't made mortgage payments on their home for several months, and their financial situation had deteriorated. But at that moment, Peggy caught a lucky break. She was approached by representatives of another company interested in buying her clinic because it had achieved great success. Peggy was faced with a tough choice. She didn't want to sell her clinic for any amount of money, as it was her life's work. However, her husband felt differently. He wanted to get rid of all their problems and difficulties, take the money, and not work. After giving in to his persuasion, Peggy agreed to sell the business. But luckily for her, the new bosses wanted both her and her husband to stay and continue working at the clinic. This was a great solution for them, but the situation didn't last long. The new owners uncovered fraudulent schemes through which the clinic had been receiving money from insurance companies for services it hadn't provided. During the period in question, Eric had been handling the finances, but his wife, as the clinic owner, took the fall. The new owners found this unacceptable and fired both of them. But losing her job wasn't the worst part for Peggy. Her clinic had been draining money from medical insurance providers for years, and someone had to be held accountable. She was facing charges of fraud and tax evasion. These are federal charges, and theoretically she could have faced 10 to 15 years in prison. Peggy confessed all this to Eric's mother, Linda. This is why Linda was convinced that Peggy had staged her own disappearance. She believed that Peggy, being a strong swimmer, had jumped overboard, easily swum to shore, and then settled somewhere in Morocco or the Caribbean. Linda thought Peggy would only return once the statute of limitations on the federal charges expired. At first, Eric's actions seemed to confirm her suspicions. He recovered surprisingly quickly after his wife's disappearance. He then sent their 3 young children to live with Peggy's parents, giving them full custody. But if anyone thought that Eric would soon try to disappear and join Peggy, they were mistaken. Just 3 months after his wife's disappearance, Eric was already dating someone new. Her name was Tina New, a model and actress who appeared in TV shows. As Eric quickly ran out of money, he decided to become a web designer. To promote his company, he planned to participate in a professional expo. He needed a model to attract attention, and a photographer friend from his volleyball team recommended Tina, whom he knew. The two hit it off right away. When Tina met Eric, she was struggling with substance abuse. Her car was in the shop, her home had no electricity due to unpaid bills, and the job offer from Eric came at just the right time. In her eyes, he seemed like a hero, a successful young businessman, so polite and courteous. So when he invited her to come home with him that same evening, Tina agreed. Eric's home was luxurious, with ocean views from every window. Almost every wall in every room was covered with family photos, many of them featuring Peggy. Eric didn't hide what had happened to his wife from Tina. Overall, he seemed like a perfect prince to her. So when the police contacted her to inform her that there was something suspicious about his wife's disappearance and asked her to inform them if she learned anything, Tina didn't believe them. The detectives left her their card, confident that once the initial charm wore off, she would call them, and they were right. Eric's new business failed after just a year, and he was catastrophically short of money to maintain the lifestyle he was used to. He lost his home, and he and Tina moved into a modest apartment. He also tried playing the stock market, but things didn't go well for him there either. The creditors were calling non-stop. Their relationship deteriorated significantly. They fought, reconciled, and fought again. It was October 1999. More than 2 years had passed since Peggy's disappearance. Tina and Eric had a fight so loud that the neighbors called the police. When the officers arrived, Eric was not in the apartment, and Tina handed them the detective's business card, asking them to call him. She told the arriving detectives that when they last spoke, she and Eric had just started dating. She was in love with him and believed the story he had told her. But now, she was certain that Eric had killed his wife. Tina told the detectives that a few weeks earlier, she and Eric had been at home, and she was watching old television shows that featured her. While fast-forwarding through the commercials, she suddenly stopped on a segment that had somehow been recorded. It was a news segment about the disappearance of Peggy Beckler. The news report discussed the water current and the weather on that day, which was completely inconsistent with what Eric had told her. Tina looked at him and said, "You lied to me." The blood drained from his face. He turned pale. Eric admitted that he had seen his wife fall overboard but hadn't been able to swim to her in time. Tina asked if he couldn't or didn't want to. He replied, "I couldn't." Then he thoughtfully added, "Or maybe I didn't want to." A bad feeling began to creep over Tina, but she decided to brush the conversation aside. A couple of weeks later, Tina and Eric were relaxing at a club where they were using illegal substances. When they returned home, they were lying in bed, still not fully recovered, when Tina suddenly exclaimed, "Oh my God, you hit her in the head." She didn't even understand why she realized this so clearly. Eric even jumped. He asked, "How do you know that?" But she didn't know until he confirmed it with those words. Tina demanded to know how it all happened. It turned out that the day before the boating trip, Eric had prepared a cooler, dumbbells, trash bags, and everything needed for margaritas. Eric told Peggy that it was a surprise, so she didn't even look into the bag. They went out into the ocean. Peggy was just lying there, relaxing, sunbathing, when her husband approached her from behind and, according to him, hit her so hard that she didn't even feel it. Then the murderer folded his wife's body in half, tied her ankles, wrists, and neck together, put 2 trash bags on Peggy, and dumped her into the water with a weight of 30 kilograms. After that, he returned to the boat several kilometers closer to shore. This meant that the Coast Guard, helicopters, and submarines were all searching for Peggy in the wrong place. Tina told the police all of this, but her words weren't enough for even an arrest of Eric because she could simply be making false accusations against her ex-boyfriend. However, this wasn't the first time detectives had heard similar allegations against Eric. They had heard the same from his best friend, Kobe Laker. A few months after the boating incident, Eric's friend, Kobe Laker, went to the police with a lawyer. Kobe had already been questioned before, but now he confessed that he had lied when he told the police that the couple had a perfect relationship. Eric had repeatedly confessed to his friend that he was fed up with his wife and could no longer tolerate her. Eric considered his wife controlling and demanding. On the other hand, she was carrying the weight of the children and the business, while he just wanted to play volleyball with his friends. She brought money into the household and he was happy to spend it. All of this Eric had shared with Kobe. One day, Eric directly asked his friend what he would think if Eric killed his wife. Allegedly, Eric was considering taking her out into the ocean and dumping her in the water in a barrel or something similar. When Kobe regained his speech, he asked if he was joking, and Eric replied, "Maybe." Kobe stated that he hadn't mentioned this before because he was scared and wanted to protect his friend. Thanks to the young man's testimony, the police officially classified the case as a homicide. But without physical evidence, including the victim's body, investigators couldn't proceed. They needed to get Eric to confess on tape. Kobe agreed to wear a recording device and meet with Eric, but he couldn't get his friend to open up. Eric remained calm and insisted that Peggy had indeed had an accident. The police had only Kobe's word against Eric's. That wasn't enough for an arrest. By the time Kobe testified, the police had long given up on the idea that Peggy had faked her disappearance to avoid fraud charges. In reality, she faced a maximum fine, not prison time, so it was unlikely she would have abandoned her beloved husband and children to hide in another country. Therefore, the police now suggested that Tina try to get Eric to talk so they could record his words and arrest him. She agreed because she was openly afraid of her boyfriend. On October 29, 1999, the police placed a listening device on the girl's back and another in her handbag. Tina and Eric met at a restaurant, with detectives positioned both inside the restaurant and outside in the parking lot. The girl was supposed to act confidently, but she was afraid that Eric would hug her and feel the device on her. Eric and Tina had a couple of cocktails, after which Tina got down to business. She told Eric that the police had come to her asking questions about Peggy's disappearance, so they needed to agree on how she would respond. The man simply replied that she hadn't been on the boat. That was all she needed to say. But that answer didn't satisfy Tina. She had always known that if anyone could get Eric to talk, it would be her. So she asked how it had come to this. Why didn't he just divorce his wife? Eric replied that he would lose money in a divorce and would never see his children again. His wife would take them away and wouldn't let him see them. But who was he fooling? Tina knew very well that as soon as Peggy disappeared, he had given custody of the children to her parents. Still, that was something. Tina continued to press. She asked how she could be sure he wouldn't do something similar to her if they continued to date, to which he replied that he would never do that again. This was not enough, but still sufficient for Eric's arrest. The detectives, of course, did not hear a confession from him because he demanded a lawyer, but when they searched him, they found a weight bench that was missing only the 15-kilogram weights. Together, they accounted for the 30 kilograms he had mentioned to Tina. The trial began. This was a unique case because the prosecution had no physical evidence of the man's crime or that Peggy was even dead. Moreover, Eric acted very cleverly, confirming that during his conversation with Tina, he meant the murder of his wife. However, he claimed that she liked bad boys and that he was trying to create that image. The prosecutor was well prepared and used all circumstantial evidence to convincingly demonstrate his version of the events of that day. Furthermore, the motive for the murder was indisputable and as old as time. Both spouses were insured for more than $2.5 million. Today, that would be the equivalent of nearly $4 million. This issue clearly concerned Eric because 3 months before Peggy's disappearance, he called her brother to inquire about the money. He wanted to know more about the policies and how the payout would work if something happened to his wife. Interestingly, a month and a half before her death, Peggy wanted to change the beneficiary of the insurance. She intended to exclude Eric so that the money would go only to the children. This indicates how little she trusted her husband in her final days. Of course, Eric did not receive the insurance payout anyway, because insurance companies are very reluctant to pay money to potential suspects. After 7 days of deliberation on February 1, 2001, Eric was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. After his wife's death, Eric did not receive the insurance money. Instead, he lost his home and income, and his new business failed. Indeed, Peggy was far more valuable to her husband alive. She was his ticket to a luxurious life, and even in the case of a divorce, he would have gained more than nothing. But evidently, he did not understand that, not to mention the fact that murder itself is a terrible crime. Overall, he did not act very sensibly. No wonder his volleyball buddy said he must have had an accomplice because he was too foolish to come up with everything on his own. Not to mention that the police had no evidence, but his long tongue led to him spending the rest of his life in prison instead of playing volleyball on the beach.